He was the man every woman in that room wanted, and he spent the entire evening talking to the one woman no one else noticed. She wore no designer dress. She drove no luxury car. She had nothing to offer a billionaire except 4 quiet words that stopped him cold, and he never recovered. What happens when a man who has everything finally meets the one thing money cannot manufacture? This is that story. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't regret it. The invitation had been sitting on Ethan Vale's kitchen counter for 11 days. He knew exactly how many days because he had walked past it every morning on his way to the coffee maker, glanced at it, and made a private decision to throw it away. Every single morning. And every single morning, something stopped him. Not enthusiasm, not curiosity, not any particular desire to sit in a room full of people who would spend the first 20 minutes pretending they didn't know how much he was worth. It was a small card, cream-colored, with neat handwriting in black ink. A dinner party. Saturday evening. The home of James and Priya Holloway, who lived in a brownstone on the kind of street where the trees had been there longer than most of the buildings. James was one of Ethan's oldest friends. Oldest in the sense that they had known each other since college, not oldest in the sense that the friendship had stayed close. Life had a way of doing that to people, spreading them thin across years and obligations and versions of themselves they no longer fully recognized. James had called twice. "Just come," he'd said the second time, with the specific tone of a man who knew he was asking a favor. Priya spent 2 weeks planning this. There'll be 8 people. Good food. You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to. Ethan had almost said no. He was good at saying no. He had built an entire professional life on the strategic deployment of the word no. No to bad deals, no to bad partnerships, no to rooms full of people who wanted something from him disguised as casual conversation. But James had called twice. And Priya made exceptional food. And if Ethan was being honest with himself, which he tried to be on most days, he had been spending too many evenings alone in that workshop, sanding things that didn't need sanding, staying busy so he didn't have to sit still. So he went. He pulled up to the Holloway brownstone at 7 minutes past 7 because arriving exactly on time felt aggressive and arriving late felt performative, and 7 minutes past felt like the honest middle. He had dressed carefully without trying to look like he'd dressed carefully. Dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves already rolled up, no watch. The watch always started conversations he didn't want to have. James opened the door before he knocked. "I owe you," James said, and pulled him into one of those backslapping hugs that men do when they're genuinely glad to see each other, but don't quite know how to say it plainly. "You owe me 2 hours of my life back," Ethan said. "We'll settle up later." James laughed and led him inside. The apartment smelled like garlic and rosemary and whatever candle Priya had lit in the hallway. Something warm, something that made the whole place feel like it had been inhabited for generations, even though they'd only moved in 3 years ago. There was already noise coming from the dining room, voices overlapping, the specific hum of a dinner party in its early stage, when everyone was still performing the best version of themselves. Priya appeared from the kitchen with her hair up and a dish towel over her shoulder, and she hugged Ethan like she was genuinely glad he existed. "You came," she said. "I came." "James said you might not." "James was right. I almost didn't." She laughed and steered him toward the dining room. "Wine's on the table. There are 8 of us tonight. You know Marcus and Diane already. The others—" She paused, and something flickered across her face, a kind of careful look. "Just be yourself, okay? That's all." Ethan didn't know what that meant. He filed it away. Marcus Webb was already there, leaning against the far wall with a glass of red wine, looking like a man who had nowhere more important to be, which was unusual, because Marcus always looked like he had somewhere more important to be. He was a corporate attorney with a face that had been described, in a profile piece once, as aggressively symmetrical. He and Ethan had a friendship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that neither of them would ever ask the other for a favor they couldn't repay. "Valet," Marcus said, raising his glass. "Webb." Ethan accepted the glass of wine Priya had pressed into his hand. "You look relaxed." "I am relaxed. I took Friday off." "Did the world end?" "Check your phone. Jury's still out." Diane, Marcus's wife, appeared beside him and kissed Ethan on the cheek. She was a pediatric surgeon with a laugh like a bell and the perpetual look of someone running on 6 hours of sleep in sheer stubbornness. Ethan liked her immensely. She was one of the few people who had never once asked him what it felt like to be a billionaire. The other guests arrived in pieces. A couple named Tom and Felicity, who were friends of Priya's from her architecture firm. Tom talked too loudly, and Felicity spent the first few minutes showing people photos of their recent trip to Portugal. Then a woman named Vanessa arrived, and Ethan heard James murmur something to Priya in the kitchen doorway that he wasn't meant to hear. Thought maybe, since it's been a while for him. James? I'm just saying she's exactly his type. James. Ethan kept his face neutral and took a sip of wine. Vanessa was tall, blonde, and arrived with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning how to enter a room. She wore a red dress and a smile that was genuinely warm and entirely aware of its effect. She was objectively beautiful. She shook Ethan's hand and looked at him directly and said, "I've heard a lot about you," in a way that managed to sound both flattering and like a small challenge. "Nothing too accurate, I hope," he said. She laughed. It was a good laugh. Ethan thought, James set this up. And then he thought, I'm going to need more wine. Bam. The eighth guest arrived 7 minutes after Vanessa, and she arrived quietly. Ethan almost missed it. He was mid-conversation with Tom about Portuguese tile work, a subject he had no strong feelings about but could navigate competently, when the front door opened again and Priya went to answer it. There was a brief exchange of voices, then footsteps in the hall. Then a woman appeared in the dining room doorway, and she stopped for just a moment, the way people do when they walk into a room that's already in motion and have to find where they fit in it. She was wearing a dark blue dress, not designer, not remarkable, the kind of dress that was simply clean and fitted and chosen because it was appropriate, not because it was meant to impress anyone. Her hair was down but unstyled, just there. She had no jewelry except small earrings. She looked at the room with dark, careful eyes, and then she said quietly, "Sorry I'm late," and Priya said, "You're not late, come in," and led her to the table. She sat down at the far end across from Ethan and 2 seats down next to Diane. Marcus leaned close to Ethan and said, very quietly, "That's the other Reed sister, Clara." "Other?" "Vanessa's the one James mentioned, the one—" Marcus paused. "Look, I'm just passing along what Priya told Diane. She said one sister is the fun one and the other is kind of quiet. Serious. Doesn't really do the whole social thing." Ethan looked down the table at Clara Reed. She was listening to something Diane was saying with the focused attention of someone who actually intended to remember it. "Which one did they set me up with?" Ethan asked. Marcus picked up his wine. "What do you think?" The dinner was, by most measures, a success. Priya had cooked a roasted lamb shoulder with preserved lemon and olives, and a warm grain salad that Tom declared the best thing he'd eaten in months, which Ethan suspected was slight hyperbole, but not total fiction. The wine was good. The conversation moved the way conversation at a well-hosted dinner moves, from easy to interesting, circling back to easy when it got too intense, finding the moments where 8 people in a room became briefly, genuinely connected. Vanessa was good at this. She was funny without trying too hard, curious in a way that drew people out, capable of pivoting between subjects with the ease of someone who'd done a lot of dinners like this one. She told a story about a work trip to Miami that had Felicity laughing until she had to put down her fork. She asked Ethan questions, real questions, not just the social lubricant kind, and listened to his answers and responded to them, and it was genuinely pleasant. It was not, in any way he could precisely identify, compelling. He kept finding his eyes moving down the table. Clara Reed ate her lamb and her grain salad, and spoke when spoken to and didn't speak when she wasn't. She didn't seem uncomfortable exactly. She wasn't anxious, wasn't withdrawn in the way of someone who wanted to escape the room. She was simply elsewhere, in some interior space that the surface-level noise of a dinner party hadn't reached. She asked Diane one question about her work that Ethan couldn't fully hear, and Diane answered at length and with evident enthusiasm, and Clara listened the way she had listened before, fully, without the darting glances or the waiting for my turn to talk that most people couldn't hide. Once, briefly, she smiled at something Diane said. It was... Ethan caught himself. He was staring at a woman he hadn't met because she smiled at a joke. He was 32 years old, not 16. He turned back to Vanessa and asked her about Miami. The subject of Ethan's work came up the way it often came up, sideways through someone else's mention of something adjacent. Tom had been talking about a community project his firm was involved with, something about affordable housing design, and James said, "You know, Ethan does something in that space too." And before Ethan could deflect, the table had turned toward him with the polite, interested attention of people who'd had just enough wine to want a story. "It's not a business thing," Ethan said. He could hear himself defaulting to the careful language he used with journalists and people who would turn whatever he said into a headline. He tried again. "I build furniture, custom pieces, for people who need things they can't buy." "What does that mean?" Felicity asked. "Can't buy?" "It means—" He stopped. He was about to say people in difficult financial circumstances and heard how bloodless it sounded. People going through hard things, grief, illness, displacement. Sometimes a home falls apart and so does everything in it. I make the furniture. "For free?" Tom asked. "Yes." There was the particular silence that follows when someone reveals something about themselves that doesn't fit the category they've been filed under. Ethan was used to it. The category Billionaire had a very specific set of expected behaviors, and builds furniture by hand for grieving strangers was not typically among them. "That's extraordinary," Vanessa said with warmth that was genuine. "It's something to do," Ethan said, which was not entirely true, and everyone at the table probably knew it, but it was the easiest exit from the conversation. From the far end of the table, a voice, quiet, not performing, not drawing attention to itself. "What's the last thing you made that someone truly needed?" The table went still. It was the kind of still that happens when a question arrives from an unexpected direction and lands somewhere the room hadn't been prepared for. Not hostile, nothing like that, just exact. The way a key turning in a lock is exact. Ethan looked down the table. Clara Reed was looking at him, not with the hungry attention of someone who wanted to catch him off guard, just looking, waiting, like the question was a real question and she expected a real answer. He stopped. He thought about the automatic answer, the polished version, the story he told at charity galas, the pediatric ward, the community center, the family of 5. Good stories, true stories. But not the last thing, not the one that had mattered most recently. "A desk," he said. The table was still quiet. Everyone was listening now. "For a woman named Ruth Calloway. She lost her husband 8 months ago, 41 years of marriage. He was a retired English teacher. He had this old desk in his study where he used to write letters, long letters, actual pen and paper letters, to people he loved. He wrote Ruth a letter every year on their anniversary, even after they'd been married for decades. Just kept doing it." Ethan paused. He hadn't meant to tell this story. The desk was falling apart. When he died, the movers broke 2 of the legs. Ruth called a friend of mine asking about repairs. The friend knew about my work, and she came to me. He could feel the weight of the room. Not oppressively, the good kind of weight. The kind that means people are actually there. I couldn't save the original desk. The damage was structural, so I built her a new one. Same dimensions, same style, same kind of oak he'd used. I found a place that still mills that species. Took me 6 weeks. He looked down at his wine glass. "I don't know if I made the right call. Sometimes I wonder if she would have preferred the broken original to a perfect replacement. But she sat down at it the day I delivered it, and she put her hand flat on the surface, and she didn't say anything for a long time. And then she said, 'He would have loved this.' And that was—" He stopped. That was enough. Silence. Not awkward. Not the silence of a room that doesn't know what to say. The silence of people who have just received something. Then Clara Reed nodded. One slow, small nod. Nothing theatrical about it. No wide eyes, no murmured, "That's beautiful." Just a nod. The way you nod when you've heard something true, and you're acknowledging it as true. And for reasons Ethan couldn't have cleanly articulated to anyone, including himself, that nod hit him somewhere specific. Somewhere below the collarbone and behind the ribs, where things tended to land when they were going to stay. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly socially appropriate. She had already looked back down at her plate. The dinner wound down the way good dinners wind down. Slowly, nobody quite willing to be the one to end it. Priya brought out dessert, a fig tart with honeyed cream that drew unanimous approval, and the conversation divided itself into smaller streams, the way it does late in the evening when the night is relaxed enough that people stop trying to hold the whole table together. Tom and James ended up in the corner talking about something to do with city planning. Felicity and Priya were discussing a building Priya had seen in Seoul. Marcus and Diane were having the quiet, efficient back and forth of a couple who had been married long enough that they could conduct an entire argument in 17 words. Vanessa moved closer to Ethan. She was not doing anything wrong. She was being warm, attentive, interested. She touched his arm once when she laughed. She told him something real about herself, that she'd spent 6 months working abroad after her last relationship ended and had come back different in a way she was still figuring out. He liked her. He was fairly sure he would like her in any context. He was also aware, with the particular clarity of a man who had learned the hard way to pay attention to what he actually felt rather than what he was supposed to feel, that he wasn't thinking about her. He was aware of her. That was different. He was thinking about a woman at the other end of the table who had asked him one question in a voice that barely carried across the room, and then nodded once and gone back to her food. At some point near 10 o'clock, he stood to refill his water and walked toward the kitchen, and on the way back he passed the far end of the table where Clara was sitting alone. The others had redistributed themselves, with a small cup of coffee and what appeared to be a copy of a magazine she'd found on the bookshelf behind her. She was reading. At a dinner party. With the quiet, unself-conscious focus of a woman who had decided the evening was winding down and she was going to spend the last part of it doing something she actually wanted to do. Ethan stopped. Not deliberately. His feet just stopped. She looked up, and for a moment there was just the two of them and the low sound of conversation from across the room. "Sorry," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Walking past, maybe. Staring. "For what?" she said. Not sharp, genuinely curious. "I don't know," he said honestly. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, more like the almost smile that precedes a decision about whether to engage. "The desk story was good," she said. "It wasn't a story, it was true." "I know," she said. "That's why it was good." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He wasn't sure why. The words came out of him before he'd made a formal decision to say them. "You're Clara." "I am." "You didn't talk much tonight." She tilted her head slightly. "Neither did you." "I talked plenty." "You performed plenty," she said. "That's different." He should have been offended. He wasn't. She wasn't being cutting. She was just being precise, and the precision landed like something accurate rather than something hostile. "Fair," he said. She closed the magazine and set it on the table. "The question wasn't meant to put you on the spot," she said. "I was actually curious." "I know." "You hesitated before the real answer." "I always do." "Why?" He thought about it. Actually thought, not just reached for the ready-made response. Because the real answers are more exposed. You give someone the real answer and you've given them something. That's harder to take back. She looked at him. Not with the slightly glassy warmth of someone who'd had a few glasses of wine and found him charming, but with the actual attention of someone who was processing what he'd said. "That's true of most things," she said. "Yeah." A moment passed. Someone laughed loudly across the room. Tom, probably, and the sound felt far away. "What were you reading?" Ethan asked. "An article about soil erosion in coastal wetlands." She paused. "James and Priya have eclectic reading material." It's Priya. James only reads contract briefs and sports scores. The almost smile became an actual one, brief and crooked and slightly asymmetric in a way that was distinctly not calculated. "How long have you known James?" she asked. 14 years, since sophomore year of college. He spilled an entire tray of food on me at the dining hall and then apologized for so long I had to tell him to stop." "That sounds like James." "You know him." "Priya's a friend of my sister's," Clara said, "which makes James adjacent." "So you're here because of Vanessa?" "I'm here because Priya asked me, and I didn't have a good enough reason to say no." Ethan almost laughed. He recognized that logic intimately. "Same," he said. She looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes. Not suspicious, more like recalibrating. They set you up with Vanessa. It wasn't exactly subtle. No, she agreed. It wasn't. Are you too close? Something careful moved across her face. We're sisters, she said, as if that contained the full complexity of the answer, which it probably did. I know, she said. I'm not saying it badly, we're just different. I noticed. She picked up her coffee cup and looked into it, and Ethan had the feeling she was deciding whether to continue the conversation or let it settle into a comfortable end-of-evening quiet. He found he was holding slightly still, the way you hold still around something that might leave if you moved wrong. The widow's desk, she said finally. You said you wonder if she would have preferred the broken original. Yes. Do you really wonder that, or is that the thing you say to make it sound like you're not sure of yourself? He stared at her. Because it reads as false modesty, she continued, and her voice was still entirely even, no challenge in it, just the clean line of an observation. You knew what she needed better than she did, and it turned out you were right, and now you're adding the uncertainty after the fact because certainty sounds arrogant, but the uncertainty isn't real. It was the most anyone had said to him that he hadn't expected in at least 2 years. How do you know it's not real? He asked. Because of the way you told the story, she said. You paused before he would have loved this. That's not someone who still has doubts. That's someone who knows they were right and doesn't know how to sit with knowing they were right. The room felt very quiet suddenly. Ethan Vale was not a man who was often caught off guard. He had spent years building a particular kind of composure. Not cold, not closed, but steady, present without being exposed. He had sat across from CEOs and investors and journalists who wanted to unsettle him, and he had sat across from women who were brilliant and beautiful and wanted to know him, and he had been fine, calibrated, himself. He was not, in this moment, entirely sure what he was. That's, he started. Too direct, she said immediately. I know, sorry. No, he said. Don't. She looked up. Don't apologize for that, he said. Please. A moment passed, the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself while it's happening. Okay, she said quietly. He stayed until midnight, not because the dinner demanded it. By 11, Tom and Felicity had gone. Marcus and Diane had departed with the clean efficiency of two people who had a system, and Vanessa had said her goodbyes with warm grace, including a lingering handshake with Ethan and a look that offered something he hadn't taken her up on. He stayed because James and Priya moved the remaining small group, Ethan, Clara, and themselves, from the dining table to the living room, and someone put on music at low volume, and it became the better, smaller version of the evening, the one that happens after the performance ends. Priya brought tea. James sprawled on the floor with his back against the couch, in the way he'd been sprawling on floors since college. Clara sat in the corner of the couch with her feet tucked under her, and she talked more now. Not expansively, not with the loosened performance of someone who'd had too much wine, but with the easy directness of someone who'd relaxed into the room. Ethan learned things. He learned that she worked for a small environmental nonprofit downtown, doing something with water rights documentation that she described in 2 sentences and then stopped, as if she'd caught herself starting to go on about it. He learned that she was putting herself through a part-time postgraduate program in environmental policy, paying for it herself, and that it was slow going, but she was not, and this came through without her saying it explicitly, someone who needed things to be fast. He learned that she didn't drive. She used the bus or biked. She had a bike that she'd named, and when Priya asked what she'd named it, Clara looked briefly embarrassed and said, Gerald, and Priya burst out laughing, and for a moment Clara's face was open in a way it hadn't been all night, caught between embarrassment and her own amusement at herself. Why Gerald? James asked from the floor. He looks like a Gerald, Clara said. He's old and reliable and very beige. That's the most commitment to a bit I've ever seen, James said. It's not a bit, she said. It's genuinely how I feel about Gerald. Ethan was smiling. He was not entirely sure when he had started smiling. At 11:45, Clara said she should go. She had an early shift and an hour on Gerald in the morning. She said her goodbyes to James and Priya with the slightly formal warmth of someone who liked people but found sustained closeness effortful, and then she looked at Ethan. It was good to meet you, she said. You too. She started toward the door. Something, not impulse exactly, more like a decision that had been building quietly all evening, made him say, "The coastal wetlands article. Was it any good?" She turned back, and there was that slight tilt of the head again. "It was about salt marsh grass and tidal flooding," she said. "So it depends on your definition of good." What was the conclusion? That we're losing them faster than we can document them, and most people won't notice until they're gone. He held her gaze for a moment. "Same could be said for a lot of things," he said. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. "Good night, Ethan Vale," she said. "Good night, Clara Reed." She went. The door closed. The apartment held the specific quiet of a place after someone has left it. Priya appeared behind him with a look on her face that he recognized as a woman about to say something he wasn't going to be able to easily rebuff. "Don't," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "Priya, I'm just standing here." James from the floor said, "She's been standing exactly there since Clara walked out the door." "I hate both of you," Ethan said pleasantly, and went to get his jacket. He drove home on empty streets, the way the city looks after midnight, when it exhales a little and remembers what it's like not to be performing. His daughter, Sophie, was asleep upstairs. He knew this without checking. The babysitter, Mrs. Garfield, had texted at 9:30. "All good, she's out." Sophie was 6 years old and slept with the absolute commitment of a person who had concluded that the day was genuinely finished and there was no point arguing with it. He envied her that. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. The cream-colored invitation was still on the counter, though now it was technically obsolete. He picked it up anyway and looked at it. Saturday evening, dinner. He thought about the version of himself 11 days ago who had stood in this same spot and considered throwing it away. He thought about Ruth Calloway's desk. He thought about a question asked in a voice that barely carried across a table. "What's the last thing you made that someone truly needed?" He had built probably 40 or 50 pieces since he started the project. Chairs, tables, bookshelves, beds. He had a list in his phone, not for publicity, not for any particular record, just because he needed to keep track of the wood and the time and the delivery logistics. Each piece had a name attached to it. Each name had a story. Nobody had ever asked him about the last one. They asked why he did it. They asked how he found the time. They asked, and this one he disliked most, though he understood it, whether it was a tax thing. Nobody asked about the specific, most recent, most human piece of the work, the one that had most recently cost him something. One question. He set the invitation down. Through the back window the night was clear. Somewhere under his feet, in the basement he'd converted into a workshop 3 years ago, there was a set of half-finished chair legs and a pile of walnut offcuts and a workbench that bore the evidence of hundreds of hours in its surface. The shallow grooves, the stain rings from coffee cups set down carelessly, the single deep scratch from the time he'd been working too fast and the chisel had slipped. He was tired. He should go to bed. Instead, he stood in the kitchen for a few more minutes, in the particular kind of quiet that follows a night when something happened that you're not yet ready to put into words. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. But before he reached the landing, he stopped. He took out his phone. He looked at it for a moment, not at anything specific, just at the screen. He put it back in his pocket. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, Sophie came into his room at 6:42 and put her cold feet on his back and said, "Dad, what's for breakfast?" And he made her eggs and toast and let her tell him about the dream she'd had about a horse that could also do math. And he listened to every word of it, and he was glad to be where he was. But twice, while the eggs were cooking, his eyes went to his phone on the counter. He didn't pick it up, not yet. He waited 4 days. Not because he was playing a game, he genuinely disliked the architecture of games, the calculated pauses and strategic silences people deployed like chess pieces. He waited because he needed the 4 days to be sure that what he was feeling wasn't just the residue of a good evening. Wine and good food and a late-night conversation in a well-lit room had a way of making things feel more significant than they were. He'd learned that the hard way, years ago, in a different life. But on the 4th day, he woke up at 5:15 in the morning because Sophie had a nightmare and came padding down the hall to his room, and he held her while she went back to sleep. And in the dark, with her small breathing steadying against his shoulder, He thought about a question asked across a dinner table in a voice that didn't reach for attention. What's the last thing you made that someone truly needed? He thought about it the way you think about something that has installed itself in you without permission. He picked up his phone. Priya had texted him Clara's number 3 days ago with a message that read, "Only, in case you want it. No pressure, no winking emoji, no additional commentary." He had given Priya more credit for restraint than he usually did. He typed, "This is Ethan Vale. We met at James and Priya's on Saturday. I wanted to reach out." He looked at it, deleted. "I wanted to reach out because it sounded like a LinkedIn message." Typed, "I've been thinking about our conversation." Looked at that. Too exposed, maybe. True, but exposed. He sent it anyway. He put the phone face down on the nightstand. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep and pressed her forehead more firmly against his arm. The reply came 11 minutes later, which he saw when he turned the phone over, and which meant she was also awake at 5 in the morning, which he noted without making too much of it. "Hi. I know who you are. Priya told me she gave you my number. You didn't have to say your last name." He almost smiled. "Old habit," he typed. "From what? Formal correspondence? From a decade of introducing myself to people who immediately started calculating my net worth. The last name makes it faster." A pause. Then, "That sounds exhausting." "It is," he wrote. "Are you always awake at 5 a.m.? "Early shift." "Are you?" "My daughter had a nightmare." Another pause, slightly longer. Then, "Is she okay?" That question, not how old is she or what was the nightmare about, or any of the social pleasantry versions, just, is she okay? Direct and specific and aimed at the actual thing that mattered. "She's fine," he wrote, back asleep. "Good," she wrote. And then after a moment, "The conversation was good. I've been thinking about it too." He read that twice. "Coffee," he typed. "This week, if you're free. Somewhere quiet." The pause this time was long enough that he set the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought, for about 90 seconds, that he'd moved too fast. Then it buzzed. Thursday afternoon. "There's a place on Clement Street called Morrow's. Small, not trendy. 4 o'clock. I'll be there," he wrote. "Okay," she wrote. He lay in the dark with his daughter's weight against his arm, and the particular feeling of a man who has set something in motion that he cannot predict the shape of, and he was, despite himself, glad about it. The 4 days before Thursday were not uneventful. He had a company to run, technically several, though he preferred to think of the whole architecture as one thing with many moving parts rather than a collection of separate enterprises. There were meetings and calls and 2 situations that required his direct attention and one that required his direct attention plus a significant amount of patience. He went to the workshop 2 evenings after Sophie was in bed and worked on the walnut chair legs he'd been neglecting, standing at the bench in the particular silence of a basement workshop at night, the kind of silence that has texture because it's insulated from everything outside it. He found himself thinking about what Clara had said, not just the observation about the widow's desk and the false modesty, though that one had teeth that he was still feeling, but the smaller things. The way she'd described her bike, Gerald, with a straight face and real affection. The coastal wetlands article. "We're losing them faster than we can document them, and most people won't notice until they're gone." He had looked her up. He wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. Not the invasive search. Not the kind of digging he could have done with resources at his disposal. He pulled back from that immediately, because it felt wrong in a way he trusted. Just the ordinary search anyone would do. Name, city, the small public footprint of a person living a private life. Her nonprofit came up. The organization was called Clearwater Advocacy, and their website was functional and entirely without vanity. No stock photos of smiling, diverse people, no splash page with a motivational quote. Just a mission statement in plain language, a list of current projects, and a small staff page with photos. Claire Reed appeared on it as a research coordinator. Her photo was taken outside, slightly squinting against sun, and she looked approximately the same as she had at dinner, which was to say like a person who was not attempting to look like anything in particular. He read the mission statement twice. Water rights. Documentation of illegal agricultural diversions from public waterways. The language was specific and technical and entirely unexciting to anyone who didn't care about it, which Ethan suspected was the point. He closed his laptop. He did not, for the rest of the week, look her up again. But he thought about her. Not constantly. Not in a way that disrupted the ordinary mechanics of his life, but with a consistency that surprised him. The way a sound can continue beneath other sounds, and you only notice it when everything else goes quiet. Thursday came. Morrow's was exactly what she'd described. Small, not trendy. The kind of coffee shop that had been in the same location for 16 years and had never once considered putting a chalkboard sign on the sidewalk. The furniture was mismatched in the way that happens naturally over time, rather than the way it happens when someone is trying to create atmosphere. There was a cat sleeping on a stool near the window. The coffee smell was deep and not performative. Clara was already there when he arrived. She was at a corner table, well, not the romantic corner, just the quiet one near the window, with a ceramic mug and an open notebook. She was writing something. She finished the sentence before she looked up, and that detail, the finished sentence, the refusal to interrupt the thought even when someone arrived, was so entirely consistent with everything else he knew about her that it almost made him laugh. "You're early," he said. "You're on time," she said. "I'm earlier." He sat down across from her. The notebook was closed now, but he'd seen, just barely, that it was dense handwriting, small and consistent, not the chaotic scrawl of a person processing emotions, but the organized notation of someone taking notes on something real. "Work?" he asked. "A deposition summary. I'm condensing 40 pages of water board testimony into something a judge can actually use." "That sounds boring," she said. "It's not. It's actually—" She paused, and he saw the same thing he'd seen at dinner, the moment where she caught herself starting to go on about something and pulled back. "It's not boring to me. Tell me," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "I don't have anywhere to be until 6. Tell me about the 40 pages of waterboard testimony." Something shifted in her expression. Not the performed surprise of someone receiving unexpected flattery, but something more real than that. The recalibration again, like she was adjusting for a variable she hadn't accounted for. "There's a farmer in the Central Valley," she said carefully, "who's been diverting a public waterway, a small tributary, onto his property for 11 years. He's doing it illegally, and he knows it's illegal, and the water board knows it's illegal, and he keeps doing it because the documentation process is slow and the enforcement is underfunded, and he's calculated correctly that it's cheaper to keep diverting the water and occasionally pay a fine than to comply." She picked up her mug. "What I'm doing is building the paper trail that makes that calculation change. Every deposition, every measurement record, every complaint from the downstream landowners who've been losing water access for over a decade. When there's enough of it in one place, in a format that holds up, it becomes harder to ignore." "How long does that take?" Ethan asked. "This particular case? Probably another 8 months before we get a hearing that has any teeth." She said it without bitterness, just as a timeline. "These things are slow. Does that frustrate you?" She considered it honestly. "Sometimes. Mostly I've learned to work inside the slowness. You do what the next step requires, and you don't look too far ahead, or you lose your mind." A pause. "I assume you know something about that. Building things from scratch, I mean. You can't look at an empty workshop and think about the finished piece the whole time." "No," he said. "You think about what's in front of you, what needs to happen next, the joint you're cutting, the measurement you're checking." "Same thing," she said. The coffee arrived. The woman behind the counter, who had gray hair and no apparent interest in whether her customers were having a good time, set it down without ceremony. Ethan wrapped his hands around the mug. It was a good temperature. He noted this about Morrow's. They had the temperatures right. That was harder than it sounded. "I read about your organization," he said. "I know," she said. "You looked me up." He didn't deny it. "Did you look me up?" "I didn't need to," she said. "You're not hard to find." "Fair. There was a profile piece in a financial magazine," she said, 2 years ago. You gave them 45 minutes and then declined to answer the last 8 questions. "They wanted to know about my divorce," he said, "and my daughter. Those weren't their business." "I thought that too," she said. "When I read it, the journalist seemed irritated." "He was. He called my publicist 3 times. "You have a publicist?" I have a person who fields calls so I don't have to. I'm not sure that's the same thing. He paused. She mainly tells people I'm unavailable. She must be busy. She's extremely busy, he agreed. I feel bad about it occasionally. Clara had her hands wrapped around her mug, and she was looking at him with the same quality of attention she'd had at the dinner table. Not trying to read him exactly, but not letting anything slide past either. He'd been looked at by a lot of people in his life. Most of them were looking at the version of him they'd already decided existed. She seemed to be looking at the actual room in front of her and deciding in real time. "Can I ask you something direct?" she said. "I'd prefer it. Why did you text me?" He thought about the careful answer, the one that was true but managed. Then he thought about what she'd said at dinner, about the widow's desk and the false modesty and the uncertainty that wasn't real. "Because I spent 4 days thinking about a question you asked at dinner," he said, "and I wanted to know what other questions you had." A beat. "That's a good answer," she said. "It's the true one." "Those are usually the same thing," she said, "for people paying attention." He looked at her. "You do that." "Do what?" "Make a point and then attach a qualifier that points it back at the person you're talking to. You said it at dinner, too. That's true of most things, like you're giving the idea back." She looked mildly surprised, not caught out, just noticed. "I don't know if I do that consciously." "Doesn't matter if it's conscious." He picked up his mug. "It's interesting." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone walked past the window with a dog that tried to stop and look in, and the person walked on, and the dog's head swiveled reluctantly away. "I'm not very good at this," Clara said. "At what?" "This." A small gesture, encompassing the table, the mugs, the situation. "Whatever this is." "Coffee?" "You know what I mean." He did. He looked at his coffee. "Neither am I, honestly. I'm better at it than I was, but that's not a high bar." "What happened?" she asked, and then immediately, "Sorry, you don't have to answer that." "My wife left when Sophie was 8 months old," he said. It came out more easily than it usually did, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because Clara had asked without construction, without the careful tone people used when they wanted the story, the real story, the dramatic one. She didn't want the life. She had a version in her head of what it would be, and the real thing was different, and she made a decision. He paused. "I don't think she was wrong to leave. I think she was wrong about a lot of the ways she did it. But the decision itself, she wasn't happy. Staying for the wrong reasons is its own damage." Clara was listening with her full attention, no sympathy face, no tilted head and gentle eyes, just listening. "Do you talk to her?" Clara asked. "We have a functional relationship around Sophie, exchanges of information, coordinating logistics." He thought about it. "We're not friends. We're not enemies. We're two people who made a person together and have to keep making decisions about her." "Does Sophie see her?" "Twice a year. The arrangement is... it's what it is. Sophie seems to have made her own peace with it. Kids are remarkably practical about the things they can't change." "They are," Claire said, in a tone that suggested she knew this from somewhere specific. But she didn't offer the specific, and he didn't push. He asked instead, "Do you have kids?" "No." "Do you want them?" A pause. Not the uncertain pause of someone avoiding an uncomfortable question, more like the pause of someone applying the same honesty to themselves that they applied to everyone else. "I think so. Not urgently. I want..." She stopped. "I want things to be stable first. I want to know that I've made something solid before I try to bring someone else into it." "That's careful." "It's maybe too careful," she said. "I've been told." "By who?" "Vanessa, mostly." Something complicated moved across her face. Not quite pain, not quite frustration. Something older than either of those. "She thinks I wait too long for everything, that I miss things because I'm calculating." "Do you think she's right?" Clara looked at the window. The dog was gone. "Sometimes," she said. "I almost didn't come on Saturday." "Priya told me there was a reason you might not come." "Priya talks a lot for someone who seems reserved," Clara said, and there was no heat in it, just accuracy. "What was the reason?" She picked up her mug. "I'd had a long week. The deposition had hit a wall. I was tired and I didn't want to sit in a room full of people being warm at each other." A pause. I almost texted Priya and said I was sick. Why didn't you? Because I'd already said I'd come, she said. And I don't do that. Say I'll be somewhere and then not be there. Ethan thought about his 11 days with the invitation on his counter. I almost didn't come either, he said. I know. James told Priya you'd said you weren't sure. He said you were boring, Ethan said. He didn't say that exactly, but that was the implication. Clara looked at him with something that was almost amusement and almost tiredness. He said something like that before. Not to me, but it gets back. She set down her mug. People decide very quickly what kind of person you are when you don't perform for them. You're not boring, he said. I know I'm not boring, she said. Not with pride, just with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who had decided a long time ago that other people's misreadings were their problem. I just don't find it useful to correct them. If they've already decided, arguing about it is a waste of time. He thought about that. Does it bother you? The misreading? It used to, she said. Less now. She paused. It bothered me at the dinner, briefly, when Vanessa came in and the whole room rearranged itself toward her and I sat down and nobody... She stopped. The sentence finished itself in the silence. I noticed you, Ethan said. He said it simply, without loading it with more weight than it carried. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. That's why I answered the question. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a moment. It was too natural to be called a moment, too ordinary. Just two people at a corner table in a quiet coffee shop, holding mugs that were starting to cool, on a Thursday afternoon when the light was coming through the window at an angle that made the room feel earlier than it was. Tell me something real, Clara said. About your life, not the furniture work. I know that story. Something else. What counts as real? Something you wouldn't say in a profile piece. He thought about it. The cat near the window shifted on its stool. He watched it settle. I can't sleep when there's something unfinished in the workshop, he said. Not emotionally unfinished, physically. Like if I leave a joint half cut or a surface half sanded, it sits under everything. I've woken up at 3 in the morning and gone down and done 2 hours of work because I couldn't stand the image of the half-finished thing. Every time? Every time. She nodded, filing it somewhere. What else? I read Sophie the same book every night for 8 months because she asked for it, and I couldn't say no. It's a picture book about a bear who can't find his hat. It's 32 pages long. I have it memorized to the point where I can recite it backwards. Which bear book? He told her the title. She knew it. How old is she now? Clara asked. 6. What's she like? And there it was again. The specific question, aimed at the real thing. Not is she a handful, or does she take after you, or any of the reflexive gambits people used when talking about other people's children. What is she like? As if she were a full person whose personhood was worth asking about directly. Ethan put down his mug. She's relentless, he said, and he heard the warmth in his own voice and didn't try to manage it. She thinks about a thing until she understands it all the way down. She asked me 2 weeks ago how trees know when to drop their leaves, and when I gave her the short answer, she said, but what tells them? And we ended up talking about photoperiodism at 7 in the morning before school. He paused. She's better than me at most things that actually matter, and she's 6 years old. Clara was quiet for a moment. She sounds like someone who's been paid attention to, she said. The sentence landed somewhere precise. I try, Ethan said, and his voice was slightly different, more careful. I get it wrong a lot. I work too much sometimes, and I'm distracted sometimes, and sometimes I'm in the workshop when I should be upstairs, and I know that about myself, and I'm still not. I haven't fully fixed it. No, she said. You probably won't fully fix it. That's comforting. I don't mean it harshly. I mean nobody fully fixes that particular thing. The best ones just keep trying to do a little better than they did yesterday. A pause. My father was absent in the way that fathers of his generation thought was acceptable. Present in the house, but somewhere else in every way that counted. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't neglectful in the obvious sense. He just wasn't there. She said it plainly. No performance of old pain, just the fact of it. I would have traded a lot for someone who at least knew he wasn't getting it right. He understood what she was giving him in that. Not comfort exactly. She wasn't trying to make him feel better. She was calibrating, telling him where she was looking from. Thank you, he said. For what? For saying that. She looked at him carefully. I say things when they're useful. It's not a gift. That's not the only reason people say things. She looked down. No, she admitted. It's not. The coffee was cold by now. Neither of them moved to order more. The cat jumped off its stool and disappeared somewhere behind the counter. Outside, the light had shifted. It was later than it had been, the afternoon coming off its peak and beginning the slow decline toward evening. I have to be back by 5:30, Clara said. I'm meeting my supervisor before the deposition notes are due. Okay. She started gathering her things. The notebook, a jacket she'd had folded over the chair back, a bag that looked like it had been used for approximately 4 years, and showed it. She moved efficiently, without fuss. Ethan watched her and thought about how different this was from every version of this thing that he'd done in the past few years. The dinners that were auditions, the conversations with the shape of conversations, but the substance of negotiations. This had been something else. He wasn't sure he had a word for it yet. Ethan, she said. He looked up. She had her jacket on and her bag over her shoulder, and she was looking at him with that direct, still quality, and she said, You build things for the reason underneath the reason. He stared at her. You said, at dinner, you said the furniture wasn't a business thing, and I've been thinking about why you said it that way. Not, it's charitable, or it's meaningful work, or any of the normal framings. You said it's not a business thing, which means the actual reason you do it isn't the building, and it isn't the giving, and it isn't even the people you're helping. He was very still. The actual reason, she said, is that you need to make things that matter, not things that earn or things that impress, things that carry weight for someone who needs the weight carried. She paused. You build because otherwise you don't know how to be sure you're doing anything real. The afternoon traffics moved past the window. The woman behind the counter said something to someone in the back room. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when they're not empty, but everyone in them is briefly, simultaneously present. Ethan said nothing for a moment. How did you do that? He said. Do what? You've had one dinner and one coffee with me. She looked at him steadily. You're not that hard to read, she said, if you're looking at what's actually there. She said goodbye without ceremony. A small nod, a brief raise of her hand, and she walked out through the door and into the Thursday afternoon, and he watched her go through the window as she passed on the street, the bag over one shoulder, moving with the purposeful walk of someone who had a place to be and intended to get there. He sat at the table for a while longer. He thought about what she'd said, turned it over, checked it against his own interior, not for flaws, not defensively, but the way you check a joint you've just cut, pressing here, testing the fit, seeing if it holds. It held. He had known people for 15 years who had not said a thing that true about him. Not because they were incapable of it, some of them were brilliant, perceptive, genuinely thoughtful people, but because they were looking at the thing he showed them and drawing conclusions from that, and she had somehow gotten underneath the showing to the structure beneath it, the actual grain of the wood, and read it correctly. He left a decent tip on the table and walked out into the afternoon. He didn't call anyone, didn't text Priya with an update she was clearly waiting for. He walked to where he'd parked the car and drove home through the tail end of the Thursday traffic, and he thought about a woman who took buses and biked on a beige bike named Gerald and spent her days building paper trails for water rights nobody would notice until they were gone, and who looked at people until she understood what was actually there. He thought about what she'd said about almost not coming to the dinner. I'd already said I'd come, and I don't do that. Say I'll be somewhere and then not be there. He pulled into his driveway. Through the front window he could see the warm interior light. Mrs. Garfield had the living room lamp on, and he could see the flicker of the television and the smaller, darker shape of Sophie sitting cross-legged in front of it, probably watching something with animals in it. She had a phase. He sat in the car for a moment before going in. He thought about the unfinished chair legs in the workshop. He thought about Ruth Calloway's desk and the 41 years of handwritten letters and the way a woman had put her hand flat on a surface of new oak and gone quiet for a long time. He thought about soil erosion and tidal flooding and the things we lose faster than we can document them. And he thought about a notebook full of small, careful handwriting and a question that had cut through an entire dinner party like something clean and direct. He got out of the car. He went inside and Sophie looked up from the television and said, "Dad, did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts?" And he said he did know that actually, and she looked personally betrayed that he'd known before she told him, and he sat down on the floor next to her and let her explain it to him anyway. And she did, at length, with diagrams involving her hands, and he listened to every word. But later, when Sophie was in bed and the house was quiet, he went down to the workshop. He stood at the bench and looked at the half-finished chair legs and the pile of walnut offcuts and the workbench with its years of quiet history pressed into the surface. He picked up a piece of walnut. He held it in his hands, felt the grain, turned it over, and he thought, "You build because otherwise you don't know how to be sure you're doing anything real." He set the wood down carefully. He picked up a pencil and his notepad, and he stood there in the basement workshop at 8:30 on a Thursday night, and he wrote her name at the top of a blank page. Not to do anything with it, just to put it somewhere physical, somewhere outside himself, where he could look at it. He looked at it for a moment, then he put the pencil down and picked up the walnut and got back to work. 3 weeks after Morrow's, Ethan knew her coffee order, the name of her supervisor at Clearwater, the specific bus route she took to work, the fact that she kept a spare notebook in her jacket pocket at all times, and that she had a scar on her left hand from a woodworking accident when she was 14 years old, which was how he found out that her grandfather had taught her to use hand tools in a garage workshop in Sacramento, and that the garage had smelled like machine oil and cedar, and that her grandfather had died when she was 17, and that she had never quite shaken the particular grief of losing someone who taught you how to make things with your hands. He found this out over 3 meetings. The coffee at Morrow's, a walk through a farmer's market the following Saturday that had been genuinely unplanned on both sides, and had happened because they were both there and recognized each other across a row of tomatoes, and a lunch the week after that at a Vietnamese place near her office that she'd chosen and he'd accepted without argument. Each time, the conversation picked up without the awkward recalibration that usually characterized early stage whatever this was. It was not seamless. There were moments where one of them said something that landed wrong, pauses that ran too long, once a miscommunication about timing that left her waiting for 12 minutes, and him arriving genuinely breathless and apologetic in a way that was not calculated. But the not seamlessness felt honest rather than damaging, like the grain in a piece of wood that runs slightly diagonal, not a flaw, just the truth of the material. Sophie had started asking about her, not by name. Ethan hadn't used her name at home yet, had been careful about that, careful in the way of a man who knew his daughter paid attention to details that most adults would miss. But Sophie had a radar for change in her father that was as accurate as any instrument, and she had picked up on something. On the Thursday evening after Morrow's, while Ethan was making pasta, Sophie had sat at the kitchen counter and looked at him with her chin in her hands and said, "You're thinking about something." "Wait, sas ish ie." "I'm thinking about whether this water is boiling," he'd said. "No, you're not," Sophie had said. "You were smiling at the pot." He had been. He had told her, carefully, that he'd met someone interesting. Not a girlfriend. He'd been deliberate about that word because Sophie was 6 and concrete, and words meant things to her in the literal sense. An interesting person, someone he was getting to know. Sophie had considered this for a moment with the serious face she used for complex information and then said, "Is she nice?" And he'd said yes, and she'd said, "Does she know about the bear book?" And he'd said not yet, and she'd nodded once, conclusively, and gone back to whatever she'd been doing. The bear book was, apparently, Sophie's threshold for trustworthiness. He told Clara about this at the Vietnamese lunch, and Clara had laughed. A real one, the kind that arrived before she had time to decide whether to let it through, and said, "What is the bear book?" And he'd told her, and she had said, "She sounds like someone who takes vetting seriously." And he'd said, "She takes everything seriously." And Clara had looked at him with the careful eyes and said, "She takes after you." He hadn't known what to do with that. He'd looked at his foe and been quietly, uselessly pleased. Vanessa called him on the Monday of the 3rd week. He almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of a call with his operations director about a supply chain issue that had been grinding on for 2 weeks. And his phone showed Vanessa Reed, and he looked at it for a moment and thought about sending it to voicemail. And then thought about Clara saying, "We're sisters," with that layered, complicated weight in her voice. And he picked up. "I'll call you back in 10, he told his operations director, and stepped out. "Vanessa," he said. "Ethan?" Her voice was warm. as it had been at dinner, and also careful in a way it hadn't been at dinner. "I hope this isn't strange. Priya gave me your number. She said it was fine." "It's fine," he said. He found a quiet corner near a window and stood there. "What's up?" "I wanted to talk to you about Clara," she said. Directly, which he respected even as he immediately felt the defensive alertness of a man who has just been told there's a conversation coming that he hadn't expected. Not in a protective older sister way, more, "Look, can I just be straight with you?" "Please," he said. "Clara is the most self-sufficient person I have ever met in my life," Vanessa said, which is both the best thing about her and also the reason she has spent the last 4 years alone. She does not ask for things. She does not lean on people. She builds these very efficient lives where she doesn't need anything from anyone, and she convinces herself that this is fine, that this is good, that she's okay. A pause. And she is okay. I want to be clear about that. She's not secretly falling apart. She's genuinely fine. But fine is not the same as good. And I think somewhere under all the efficiency and the self-sufficiency and the Gerald the beige bike thing, she wants more than fine. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because she called me on Thursday night," Vanessa said, "after your coffee. And she said, she didn't say much because she's Clara and Clara doesn't say much. But she said it was a good conversation. And for Clara, in Clara language, that is essentially the equivalent of anyone else saying, 'I think this might be something.'" Something shifted in his chest. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions," Vanessa continued. "I'm not giving you the shovel talk. I'm not telling you to be careful with her. I know she can take care of herself, and honestly, she'd probably be furious if she knew I was calling you." A small laugh. "I just wanted you to know that she doesn't say that. She doesn't describe conversations as good. She describes them as fine or informative or occasionally useful. Good is not in her normal rotation." Ethan looked out the window at the city below. "She almost didn't come to the dinner," he said. "She told me," Vanessa said. "She also told me you were the only person at the table who talked to her like she was actually there." Her voice was quieter now, the professional warmth stripped back a little. "Ethan, I love my sister, and I know I'm the one people think is the fun one, the charming one, the one James and Priya probably had in mind when they invited you. And I don't have feelings about that in terms of you. What I have feelings about is my sister, who is extraordinary and specific and has spent her entire adult life being underestimated by people who can't see past the quiet." A pause. "Just don't do that." "I'm not doing that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I called." After he hung up, he stood at the window for a while. The city moved below him with its usual indifference. His operations director sent a follow-up email about the supply chain issue with a slightly pointed subject line. He did not immediately return to it. He thought about Clara at the dinner table, sitting slightly apart from the noise of the room, reading a magazine about soil erosion while the evening wound down around her. He thought about a girl of 14 putting her hand on a woodworking tool in a garage in Sacramento that smelled like machine oil and cedar, learning how to make a cut from a man she would spend the rest of her life missing. He thought about a woman who biked to work on a beige bike named Gerald and built paper trails for lost water rights and described a coffee conversation as good, once, to her sister, in private, not knowing it would go anywhere. He went back to his desk and read the supply chain email and handled the thing that needed handling. But he texted her that evening. Just, "The Vietnamese place was good. I want to try the one on Bancroft next time if you're open to it." She replied 40 minutes later. "I've been to that one. It's better." "How much better?" "Meaningfully better. Different broth entirely. High stakes," he wrote. "All broth is high stakes," she wrote back, and he could hear the dry, straight-faced delivery of it. And he put his phone down on the workbench and picked up his chisel and worked for 2 hours with the quiet, grounded feeling of a man who knows something is building without knowing yet what it will be. The invitation to see the workshop came out of the wrong end of a bad week. It was Clara's bad week, not his, though his was unremarkable by comparison. Her deposition case had hit a procedural wall, something involving a filing error that wasn't her fault, but had cost 3 weeks of timeline and required her to redo a section of documentation from near scratch. Her supervisor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who Clara described with the specific, carefully measured language of someone who respected a difficult person, had been under pressure from their board and had passed some of that pressure downward in ways that were not, Clara had said on the phone Tuesday night, entirely fair. They had started talking on the phone. Not long calls. Clara didn't do long calls. She'd told him once that phone conversations without visual cues felt like navigating a room in the dark, but regular ones. 10, 20 minutes, usually in the evenings. He sat in the workshop and she sat wherever she sat, and they talked about things in that specific register that develops between two people who have decided to be honest with each other but are still mapping the edges of how much honesty to offer at once. On Tuesday, she'd told him about the filing error and the supervisor and the 3 lost weeks, and he'd listened without offering solutions. He'd learned in those 3 weeks that she did not want solutions offered before she'd finished saying the thing. She wanted the thing to be received. He could offer thoughts after, if he had anything useful. But the receiving came first. She talked for about 12 minutes. He asked 2 questions, both specific, aimed at the actual problem rather than her feelings about the problem, which he'd also learned was what she wanted. She could manage her own feelings. She wanted engagement with the substance. At the end, she said, "I hate when I work this hard on something, and then a bureaucratic technicality makes it feel like I'm further back than when I started." "You're not further back," he said. "You have everything you built before the setback. You just have to build the one thing again." A pause. "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I'm just saying it out loud so it exists somewhere outside your head." Another pause, different in quality. "That's a useful thing to do," she said, and the quietness in her voice had shifted slightly, something in it that wasn't usually there. "Come see the workshop," he said. It came out before he'd finished deciding to say it. He felt it happen, the sentence leaving him before the careful part of his brain had approved it, and waited. Silence on the line. "Your workshop," she said. "Yes. Where you actually work. It's in the basement. It's not a showroom. It's where I actually work. Sawdust on everything. Half-finished things. It's probably not impressive." "I don't need impressive," she said. "I know." Another pause. He could hear her thinking. Not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of someone making an actual decision, weighing it correctly. "Saturday," she said. "Afternoon." 2 o'clock, he said. "I'll text you the address." "Okay," she said. "Clara." "Yeah." "Bring Gerald if you want. There's space to lock a bike out front." A beat. Then, quietly. "Okay." She came on Saturday at 2:15, which he suspected was deliberate. A small margin of lateness to avoid being the eager one, which he found entirely consistent and did not mention. He heard the bike before he heard the knock, the specific sound of a bicycle being locked to the fence railing, the click of the lock, footsteps up the front path. He opened the door before she knocked. She was wearing jeans and a dark green jacket, and her hair was pulled back in a loose way that suggested she had done it quickly and not thought about it further. She had a tote bag over one shoulder. She looked at the house, a large older craftsman that he'd bought 6 years ago and had been slowly restoring with the same patient methodology he applied to everything, and then at him. "Nice house," she said. "It was nicer before I started restoring it," he said. "It's in the middle phase. Everything looks worse in the middle phase." "I know about middle phases," she said, and stepped inside. He gave her the brief tour that the house required at this stage. The rooms that were finished, the rooms that were not. The hallway where the original wainscoting had been stripped but not yet replaced. She looked at everything with the focused attention she brought to most things, asking 1 or 2 specific questions. When they passed Sophie's room, door open, Sophie being at a birthday party until 4, Clara paused for a moment and looked in without stepping inside. It was a child's room in the fullest sense. Drawings pinned to every available wall space, books in the specific disorder of being genuinely used, a small collection of rocks on the windowsill organized by a logic that only Sophie understood. "She collects rocks?" Clara asked. "She collects evidence," Ethan said. "She finds things that seem important and keeps them until she understands why." Clara looked at the windowsill a moment longer than necessary. "Takes after you," she said again, quietly, and moved on. The workshop was accessed through a door at the back of the kitchen, down a half flight of stairs. Ethan went down first and hit the lights. The overhead fluorescents he used for actual work, not the warm ambient lighting that a more performative person might have switched on for a visitor. The room came up in honest flat light, showing everything. The long workbench along the far wall with its years of accumulated marks, the tool wall where everything hung in its designated place because disorder cost time, and time was the one resource he couldn't manufacture. The lumber rack along the left side organized by wood type and dimension. The two half-finished pieces currently in progress. The walnut chair, and the beginning stages of a small bookcase in white oak. And the fine dust that settled on everything regardless of how often he swept. Because that was the nature of the work. The room smelled like wood and linseed oil, and the particular metallic edge of a space where tools were kept sharp. Clara came down the stairs and stopped at the bottom and looked around. She didn't say anything for a moment. Not the pause of someone trying to find something complimentary to say, the pause of someone actually looking. "The walnut chair," she said, moving toward it. "3 of them," he said, "for a family that lost most of their furniture in a fire. They've been in transitional housing for 4 months. They'll have an apartment by the end of the month." She crouched down beside the nearest chair, which was at the stage where the joinery was done but the surface work hadn't started. She looked at the joints, the mortise and tenon where the rear legs met the seat rail, the careful fit of it. She didn't touch it, which he noticed. She looked first, asked permission with her eyes before reaching out, and when he nodded, she ran one finger along the joint. "Clean," she said. "My grandfather taught me joinery," he said, and then stopped, because that was not a thing he said to people. His grandfather was the workshop in Oregon, the summers, the smell of Douglas fir, the old man's hands showing him how to read the grain before you cut against it. He hadn't said that to anyone in years. Clara looked up at him from her crouched position. "Your grandfather," she said. "He had a shop in Oregon. I spent summers there." He picked up a piece of walnut offcut from the bench and turned it over in his hands, not because he needed to, but because having something in his hands made talking easier. "He's the reason I know how to do this. He's also the reason I kept doing it when I could have stopped." A pause. "He died when I was 23. I was in the middle of building my first company, and I didn't get back to see him enough in the last year, and He stopped. "Set the offcut down. That's the actual reason I keep making things for people. Not the charitable impulse, not the billionaire with a conscience narrative. I keep making things because it was what he and I had, and it's the only way I know to keep having it." The workshop was very quiet. Clara had straightened up from the chair. She was standing about 4 feet from him, and the afternoon light was coming down through the single high window on the south wall. The light that only hit this room between 2 and 4 on weekend afternoons. The specific warm light that Ethan had come to associate with the best hours of work. It caught the dust still floating from where she'd moved toward the chair, and the effect was the particular beauty of an unbeautiful room in a good moment. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't plan to say that," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's why I said thank you." He looked at her, the light, the dust, the smell of walnut and linseed oil. He had been in this room with many hours of his own silence, and occasionally with Sophie on weekends when she sat on the stool in the corner and drew in her sketchbook while he worked, and he had never felt the room as specifically inhabited as he felt it now. "Can I show you something?" he said. "Yes." He led her to the tool wall and took down a hand plane, an old one. Stanley No. 4, the iron worn smooth from decades of use, the handle refinished by his own hand some years back. He held it out to her, and she took it with both hands, correctly. The way you hold a tool when someone who knows how to use it hands it to you. "My grandfather's," he said. "He gave it to me the summer I was 19. It was already old then." He said, "A plane doesn't care what you're building. It cares about the surface in front of it." He meant it about the tool, and also not about the tool. She turned it over, looked at the blade, the chip breaker, the tote. "It's been taken care of," she said. "Every few months I go through everything on that wall," he said. "Oil the wooden parts, sharpen the blades, check the handles." He paused. "It's the only kind of maintenance I do consistently." "Why that kind?" "Because it's physical and finite, and when you're done you can see that it's done." He said it without ornamentation. "Most of the maintenance in my life I don't know if I'm doing right. The workshop tools I know." She held the plane for a moment longer. Her hands were good hands. Not soft, not rough, but used. The scar on her left hand from the 14-year-old's woodworking accident was visible in this light, a pale crescent below the knuckle of her index finger. He had noticed it before. He had not mentioned it before, because it was hers, and she would offer it when she was ready, and she had, weeks ago, in a way that said what it needed to say without asking for anything in return. She handed the plane back to him. He put it on the wall. They stood in the afternoon light for a moment, and it was not uncomfortable, the silence. It was the specific, comfortable silence of two people who have stopped performing for each other and haven't yet found something else to do with the space. "I almost didn't come Saturday," she said. "The dinner, I told you that." "You did," he said. "I've been thinking about why I told you." She said it carefully, like she was working out the thought as she spoke rather than delivering a prepared version. "I don't usually offer that kind of thing. The near-miss stuff. I almost didn't come. I almost said no. It feels like asking someone to feel lucky that you showed up, which is a manipulative thing to do even if you don't mean it that way." "But you said it," he said. "I said it because it was true and because I wanted you to have it." A pause. "I don't give people things I don't want them to have." The afternoon was outside the window, and the dust was still floating, and he was standing in his grandfather's workshop with a woman who had crouched beside an unfinished walnut chair and looked at the joinery first. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay, and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully. I know you can do both, and I'm asking for the honest one." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "Ask." "What are you afraid of?" he said. "With this, whatever this is." She didn't look away. He had half expected her to, not from cowardice. He didn't think she was a coward, but from the instinct toward privacy that she wore like a second skin. But she looked at him directly, and she thought about it for a moment. Actually thought, in the way she did, going all the way down before she answered. "That I'm not enough," she said. "Not in the way people usually mean it. Not that I'm not pretty enough or successful enough or whatever the normal metrics are. I don't actually care about those." A pause. "I mean that I'm quiet. I'm private. I don't fill rooms or light them up or make things easier by being in them the way some people do. I work too much and I go too deep into things that most people don't care about, and I am not, by any measurement, easy." "Yes." She said the last word with a self-awareness that was not self-pity, just accuracy. "And you have a life that's full of complexity already. A daughter, a business, the workshop, all of it. And I think about whether what I have to offer is enough to matter against all of that, or whether I'm just the interesting woman from the dinner who asked a good question and the reality of me is smaller than the impression." She stopped. The workshop held her words. He looked at her. The dark green jacket, the pulled back hair, the hands that had held his grandfather's plane correctly, the scar below the left knuckle, the eyes that were waiting for him to say something without needing him to say the right thing, just the true thing. "You asked me what the last thing I built was," he said. "That's not a small question. That question took me apart and put me back together in the space of about 30 seconds, in a room full of people. And you asked it like you already knew that a true answer existed and you were just waiting to see if I'd give it." He paused. "That's not a small thing. That's not an impression." She was quiet. "And what I have to offer is also not easy," he continued. "I work obsessively, and I go to the workshop when I should go to bed, and I have a daughter who will absolutely audit you against a picture book about a bear. And I'm still figuring out how to be a person who is also a father, and also this..." A gesture at the workshop, the tools, the whole edifice of the life he'd built, all at the same time. "I don't have it worked out. I don't pretend to." "I know you don't," she said. "So we're both not easy," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd rather be not easy with you than easy with anyone else," he said. He said it plainly, no flourish, no strategic delivery. It was just the sentence that was true, and he said it. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that wasn't the almost smile, wasn't the recalibration look, wasn't the careful thought expression. It was something more unguarded than any of those, something he hadn't seen from her before. A brief opening in the composure that she hadn't bothered to close because she'd decided, in this room, in this light, not to. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Clara looked at the white oak bookcase in progress on the bench and said, "What's that one for?" And her voice was slightly different than it had been before. Not the voice of someone building a wall, but the voice of someone who had decided to stay on this side of it for a while. "A retired teacher," he said. "She donated her entire personal library to a community center, and now she has empty shelves she doesn't know what to do with. She asked for something to put things in that aren't books." He paused. "Mementos," she said. "Things from a life." Clara looked at the nascent bookcase for a long time. "White oak," she said. "It ages well," he said. "Gets better looking the longer it's around. The grain opens up." He picked up a small sample from the bench, a finished piece of white oak, plain, smooth, oiled. "See the ray fleck? You only get that when you quarter saw it. More work, but it's worth it." She took the piece from him and looked at the surface, tilting it in the afternoon light to catch the fleck. The silver gold shimmer in the grain that was the particular signature of white oak cut the right way. "That's extraordinary," she said quietly. "It's just the wood," he said. "It was always there. You just have to know which way to cut." She looked up at him, and he was not entirely sure whether they were still talking about oak. Sophie arrived home at 4:15, delivered by another parent's car, exploding through the front door with the specific velocity of a 6-year-old who had eaten birthday cake and was running on the specific energy that birthday cake and peer group excitement produces in small children. She went from the front door to the kitchen to the back door to the stairs in about 45 seconds before she registered that there was someone in the house she hadn't expected. She stopped at the kitchen doorway. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water, having come up from the workshop 20 minutes prior when they'd both agreed, without much deliberation, that neither of them was ready for the afternoon to end. Ethan was making coffee. He heard Sophie stop and turn to look. Sophie and Clara were looking at each other. Sophie's expression was the one she used for complex new information, serious, slightly narrowed eyes, taking full inventory. Clara was very still, not stiff, not uncomfortable, but still in the way of a person who understood that this moment required a specific kind of patience and was prepared to offer it. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," Clara said. A pause that lasted about 4 seconds, which in the economy of a 6-year-old's attention span was a significant amount of time to hold without moving. "Are you the interesting person?" Sophie said. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Clara looked at Sophie with something that was almost the crooked smile, not quite. "I hope so," she said. "What counts as interesting?" Sophie considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Do you know things?" "Some things," Clara said. "Not all things." "What kind of things?" "Water," Clara said. "I know a lot about water, and how to find out when someone is using it who shouldn't be." Sophie's eyes went fractionally wider. "Like catching people?" "Exactly like catching people," Clara said, very slowly, with a lot of paperwork. Sophie processed this. The kitchen held its breath. "Dad knows about trees," Sophie said. "He knows when to cut them and which way." "I know," Clara said. "He was just telling me." Sophie looked at her father, then back at Clara, then at the table, at the glass of water in Clara's hands, in the specific way she looked at things she was filing under important. "Okay," Sophie said, and went to the refrigerator, got herself a juice box, and disappeared into the living room as abruptly as she'd appeared. Ethan let out a breath. Clara looked at him across the kitchen. "She's good," Clara said quietly. "She's better than good," he said. "She's terrifying. In the best way. In the absolute best way," he agreed. He brought the coffee to the table and sat down across from Clara. And outside the kitchen window, the afternoon was doing what late Saturday afternoons do in the fall, pulling the light down gradually toward gold. And Sophie was in the next room making the small ambient sounds of a child absorbed in her own world. And the coffee was hot. And the house smelled like wood and linseed oil from the workshop below. And whatever Ethan had been cooking earlier. And it was ordinary. It was ordinary in the way that only the best things are ordinary. Not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening felt like it belonged. Like the grain in white oak that runs all the way through, not imposed, not manufactured, just there. Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She didn't say anything for a while. Neither did he. From the living room, Sophie said, to no one in particular, octopuses have 3 hearts. Clara looked at Ethan. I know, she said softly. 3 hearts. He looked at her across the table in the gold afternoon light, in the house that was still in its middle phase, in the kitchen above the workshop where his grandfather's plane hung on the wall next to things still being made, and he thought, this, not a decision, not a conclusion, just a recognition, the way you recognize a piece of wood that's right for a specific purpose. The weight of it, the grain of it, the way it sits in your hands and feels like it was always going to be this. Just this. The thing about trust is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a specific moment you can point to later and say, there, that was when it happened. It accumulates the way wood takes on oil, gradually, in layers, each one thin enough to seem like nothing until one day the surface is different from what it was, and you realize the change has been happening all along without your noticing. October became November. The walnut chairs were finished and delivered to the family in their new apartment. A second-floor unit in a building on the east side of the city, small rooms, good light, 3 kids who ran through the space with the barely contained energy of children who had been in transitional housing for 4 months and were not yet entirely convinced the new place was real and permanent. Ethan had brought the chairs in his truck and carried them up the stairs himself, and the mother, a woman named Delia, early 40s, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding things together on pure will for longer than was reasonable, had sat down in one of them and put her hands flat on the armrests and said nothing. Just sat. The way Ruth Calloway had put her hand on the desk surface and gone quiet. He had driven home thinking about Clara. He thought about her in that register now. Not constantly, not obsessively, but as a presence that ran underneath his daily thinking the way a good bass line runs under a song. Background and structural and, once you noticed it, impossible to unhear. She came to the house on Sundays sometimes. Not every Sunday. The arrangement was loose and unspoken, more like a pattern that had formed naturally than a schedule anyone had made. She would text on Saturday evening, something brief and practical. Free tomorrow afternoon if you are. And he would text back, equally practical, and she would arrive on Gerald at some point between 2 and 3 and stay until Sophie's bedtime, which was 8 o'clock on school nights and became, gradually, a point around which the whole afternoon organized itself. The Sophie situation had developed with a thoroughness that Ethan had not expected and could not have engineered. Sophie, who had audited Clara against the Bear Book standard and found her provisionally acceptable, had spent the first 2 Sunday visits in a state of cautious observation, present but not demanding, watching with the sideways attention of a child who is deciding whether to invest. She had asked Clara, over the course of those 2 visits, what water rights meant, whether Gerald had ever broken down, what the difference was between salt water and fresh water, and whether Clara thought rocks or sticks were more interesting to collect. Clara had answered every question fully and without condescension, which was the only thing that would have worked with Sophie and which most adults in Ethan's experience failed to manage. The rock or sticks question had generated a 7-minute conversation that ended with Clara saying carefully that she thought rocks held information longer, but sticks held it more visibly, and Sophie had looked at her for a full 5 seconds and then gone and gotten her rock collection from the windowsill and placed it on the kitchen table for examination. Ethan had stood at the kitchen counter and watched his daughter explain each rock to Clara, and Clara had picked up each one and looked at it with genuine attention and asked where it came from, and Sophie had told her, and the afternoon had settled around them like the gold light in the workshop. Ordinary, specific, impossible to manufacture. He had stood there and felt the particular vertigo of a man watching something become real, that he had not quite allowed himself to believe was becoming real. November brought complications. His ex-wife called on the 2nd Tuesday of the month. Jennifer. She called every 6 weeks or so, always on a Tuesday for reasons he'd never determined, always in the evening after Sophie was in bed. The calls were functional, logistics, Sophie's school updates, upcoming schedule changes, and had been for the past 3 years almost entirely free of the emotional charge that the first 2 years of post-divorce communication had carried. They had arrived, eventually, at a mode of engagement that was professional in all the ways that mattered, clear, civil, efficient, and containing nothing extraneous. This call was different. "I want to be in the city for Sophie's birthday," Jennifer said. "In March. I want to be there for the day, not just the video call." Ethan was in the kitchen, He moved to the back window and looked out at the dark yard. Okay, he said carefully. Her birthday is on a Saturday this year. I know when her birthday is. I know you know, he said. I was noting the logistics. A pause. I thought you'd push back. Why would I push back on you being present for your daughter's birthday? Because, she stopped. Because that's usually how these conversations go. The conversations go the way they go because of what we each bring to them, he said. He said it without heat, because the heat had cooled years ago and what remained was just the shape of it. The fact that they had been something to each other once and weren't anymore, which was neither tragic nor not. If you want to be here for her birthday, you should be here for her birthday. Tell me the timing and I'll make sure she knows you're coming. Another pause, longer. Are you okay? Jennifer said. You sound different. Different how? I don't know. Less defended. He thought about that. About a workshop on a Saturday afternoon and gold light and a woman who had said okay when he said he'd rather be not easy with her than easy with anyone else. I'm fine, he said. I'll text you the schedule. After he hung up, he stood at the window for a while. The yard was dark and bare, the trees stripped down to their structure the way trees go in November, showing what they actually were without the cover of leaves. He had always liked trees better in November for that reason. You could see the architecture. He texted Clara. My ex-wife is coming for Sophie's birthday in March. First time in person in 2 years. I don't know how I feel about it. He looked at the text, added, That's probably more than you needed to know at 11 on a Tuesday. She replied in 4 minutes. It's fine. How does Sophie feel about it? She doesn't know yet. I'm figuring out how to tell her. Tell her straight, Clara wrote. She'll handle straight better than managed. He read that twice. I know, he wrote. I just want to get it right. You can get it right and still get it wrong in places, she wrote. That's what getting it right looks like when you're actually doing it. He put the phone down on the counter. Outside, the bare trees held their structure against the dark sky. He told Sophie the next morning at breakfast, while the eggs were cooking. He told her straight, Your mom is going to come visit for your birthday in March. She wants to spend the day with you. Sophie had listened with a serious face, eating her toast, not interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Will you be there too? She asked. I'll be wherever you want me to be, he said. I want you there, she said, and went back to her toast with the conclusive air of someone who had filed this information correctly and moved on. He texted Clara later, told her. She handled it. You were right. Of course she handled it, Clara wrote. She's been handling things since she was 8 months old. The crack in that observation, the accuracy of it, the way it named something real about his daughter that he felt but hadn't articulated, was the kind of thing Clara did that still, after weeks of regular conversation, arrived with the impact of something new. He called her that evening instead of texting. I want to ask you something, he said, before she'd said more than hello. And I want to tell you something first so you have context for the question. A pause. Okay, she said. I've been careful, he said. With this, with whatever we're doing. I've been careful because she's not a reason to hold back. She's not a complication. She's the most important person in my life. And because of that, I needed to be sure I wasn't confusing what I was feeling with something else. Loneliness, or the novelty of someone who looks at me without calculating anything. I needed to be sure what I was feeling was the real thing, and not just the relief of someone finally seeing clearly. Silence on the line. The careful, full attention silence. And, she said, it's the real thing, he said. I'm sure about that now. I've been sure for a while, and I've been waiting for a good moment to say it, and I've decided there isn't going to be a specifically good moment. There's just going to be a moment where I stop not saying it. The silence lasted long enough that he felt it in his chest. I've been careful too, she said finally. Her voice was slightly different, not the measured, thoughtful version she deployed in careful conversations, but something underneath that, raw-edged. For the same reasons and some different ones. The different ones are, I told you in the workshop, I'm not easy. I don't make things easier by being in them. I go deep into things that other people lose patience for, and I don't know how to be decorative about it. I know, he said. I don't want decorative. I know you say that. I don't just say it. Another pause. I know you don't, she said. Quieter now. That's what I've been trying to be careful about. The fact that you mean it. Because When someone means it, that's when it costs something. When they don't mean it, it doesn't matter whether you believe them or not. When they do, she stopped. When they do, he said, it means something has to be decided. Yes, she said. So decide, he said. Not hard, just direct. Saying it plainly the way she had once said he answered the question would be plainly the way she'd said you weren't wrong to him across a coffee shop table, precise and simple and fully meant. The pause this time was not uncertainty. He recognized the difference now, had learned the grammar of her silences well enough to know which ones were her thinking and which were her feeling and which were the ones where she was doing something that cost her, opening a door she would not be able to close again. I don't want to be careful anymore, she said. I'm tired of being careful with this. Then don't be. Ethan? Clara. A short, soft sound that might have been a breath or might have been the almost laugh. Then, okay, I'm in. Whatever this is, I'm in it. He was standing in his kitchen at 11:15 on a Wednesday night in November, and the house was quiet and his daughter was asleep upstairs, and he was holding his phone with both hands pressed against his face, and he was 32 years old and standing in the middle of something real. Good, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Yeah, she said. Hers wasn't either. They talked for another 40 minutes after that. Not about anything significant, just the ordinary conversation that fills the space after something large has been said and the air needs to come back into the room. She told him about a development in the water rights case. The deposition had cleared its procedural wall and the timeline was back on track. He told her Sophie had decided to expand the rock collection to include specimens from other countries, and had started researching online which countries had the most interesting geological formations. She's going to be a geologist, Clara said. She's going to be whatever she decides in the next 6 months, Ethan said. Last month it was marine biologist. Month before that she wanted to be a train conductor. Octopuses, geology, trains. She casts wide. She's thorough, he said. She wants to understand everything before she commits. Clara was quiet for a moment. She got that from you, she said. Or she got it on her own, he said. Both can be true, she said. He thought about that after they hung up, stood in the kitchen in the specific quiet of a house at midnight, and thought about how both things could be true, that Sophie had his particular thoroughness and also that Sophie was entirely her own, that he had been careful and also that he had been afraid, that what he felt was real and also that he had no guarantee of how it would go. He went to the workshop. Not to work. He just went and stood at the bench and put his hands on the surface of it and looked at the white oak bookcase, which was progressing well, which would be done by the end of the month and delivered to the retired teacher with the empty shelves where her books used to be. He thought about things that hold information. Rocks, Clara had told Sophie, held it longer. Sticks held it more visibly. He wondered what he held it in. He thought, in the things you make, in the surfaces you put your hands on, in the questions you finally answer truthfully. He turned off the workshop light and went to bed. The crisis arrived on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of November, and it arrived through Marcus Webb, which meant it arrived with the weight of someone who did not use words like crisis lightly. Marcus called at 3:15. Ethan was in a meeting and saw the name and excused himself because Marcus calling in the middle of a business day was not a thing that happened for minor reasons. Someone's going to run a piece, Marcus said. No preamble. In the years Ethan had known him, Marcus saved preamble for conversations that didn't require speed. A freelance journalist, name is Derek Caulfield, sold it to one of the big reach online platforms. It's about you and Clara. Ethan went very still. How? He said. Not a question. Just the word. Someone at the Holloway's dinner, I don't know which one, and it doesn't matter right now. What matters is Caulfield has the basics. Who she is, that you've been seeing each other, that he's framing it as a contrast piece. Billionaire, poor woman. He's using that language. She's not. Ethan stopped. The word poor felt like something being done to her without her consent. Not because it was inaccurate by conventional financial measure. She would have acknowledged it herself without embarrassment. He knew that about her. But because in Caulfield's framing, it was a reduction, a character assigned to a person without asking. What's the timeline? He's planning to run it Monday. He sent a request for comment to your publicist an hour ago. Ethan was already moving, already running the logistics. The part of his brain that handled crises engaging with the cold efficiency it had been trained into over a decade of navigating a public life he hadn't entirely asked for. Lawyer, publicist. The specific conversation with Clara that was going to happen tonight, today, now. Clara, send me everything you have, he said to Marcus. I'll call you back in an hour. He called Clara before he called his publicist. He sat in his car in the parking garage. The meeting had been in a building downtown, and called her, and she picked up on the third ring, and he could hear office sounds behind her, the ambient noise of her workday. Are you somewhere you can talk? He said. A pause. She heard it immediately, the quality in his voice that meant something had happened. Give me 2 minutes, she said. The office sounds diminished, and then a door closed, and then she was back, and the background was quiet. Tell me, she said. He told her. Plainly, completely, without managing it, all of it, including the detail about the dinner guest who had talked, including the framing Caulfield was using, including the Monday timeline. He gave her the information the way she always gave him information, all of it, no softening, no artificial minimizing, trusting that she could handle what was real. She was quiet through all of it. When he finished, there was a pause that he let sit. Okay, she said. Clara, I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not spiraling, I'm thinking. A pause. He's going to call me too, or he's already tried. Probably. I don't have a publicist, she said, and there was something dry in her voice, not quite humor, more like the reflex of a person who has been navigating the world without resources and knows the specific shape of that. I have a phone and a supervisor who is going to ask me what this means for the organization. I'll get you someone to talk to, he said. A lawyer, someone who knows. I don't want you to fix it, she said, not sharply, just clearly. I want to know what you think I should do. He stopped. Tell me what you want, he said. First, not what you think you're supposed to want, not what makes the situation cleaner. What do you actually want? Silence. I want them not to print it, she said. I want my life to continue being my life and not a story someone is telling to generate clicks. I want... Her voice went slightly different. I want to not have to deal with the fact that the reason this is a story is that a billionaire is dating someone poor and that someone in a room decided that was interesting enough to sell to a journalist. He heard what was underneath the last sentence, not just anger at the breach of privacy, something older. The specific injury of being made into a contrast, a detail in someone else's narrative, the quiet woman, the poor one, the interesting choice. He had watched it happen at that first dinner, and he had been furious on her behalf before he'd even known her. And now someone was proposing to do it at a scale that made the dinner table look like nothing. I'm sorry, he said. It's not your fault. No, but it's my life that made this a story. Without my... He stopped. Net worth. He hated the phrase. Without what I have, two people getting to know each other isn't a story. I know, she said. Her voice was tired, and he heard it, the specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying a weight they didn't ask to carry for a long time. I know that. What do you want to do? He said. I don't know yet. A pause. Can I come over tonight? Yes, he said immediately. Sophie will be there. Sophie is always there, he said. She's not going anywhere. A sound, the almost breath, the almost laugh. No comment, she said. I'll pick up food on the way home. Come whenever you're ready. She came at 7. Gerald was locked out front. She had her bag and her jacket and the specific look of someone who had spent the second half of their workday managing one problem while thinking about a different one. She came inside, and Sophie, who was at the kitchen table working on a drawing, looked up and said, "Hi, Clara," with the easy familiarity of someone for whom this arrival was already ordinary, and something in Clara's face changed. The specific thing that happened to a person's face when they are received without ceremony by someone who expects them to be there. "Hi, Bug," Claire said. She had started calling Sophie that 3 weeks ago, spontaneously, and Sophie had accepted it with the verdict of a child who considers these things carefully and had decided it was appropriate. Sophie went back to her drawing, Clara sat down at this kitchen table across from Sophie, and Ethan put food on the table. He'd stopped at a Thai place on the way home, plastic containers of things Sophie would eat, and they ate together in the loose way of three people who are still learning the specific shape of their collective rhythms, which was not a smooth thing, not a finished thing, but a real thing. Ethan told Clara, over dinner, that he'd spoken to his lawyer and that there were some options. The piece could be challenged on privacy grounds, limited, but possible. A preemptive statement was another option, getting ahead of the framing by establishing their own. Or they could do nothing and let it run and deal with the aftermath. What does doing nothing cost you? Clara asked. Professionally? Almost nothing. I've had worse things written. Personally, he thought about it. It depends what it costs you. It costs me my privacy, she said, and it turns me into a character in a story about you. She said it without venom, just with the flat clarity of someone naming a thing accurately. I have coworkers who will read it. I have a supervisor who will have questions. She paused. I have a life that is mine, and I don't want it narrated by someone who sees the contrast and thinks that's the whole story. Then we put out a statement, Ethan said. Short, factual, on our own terms. We don't ask for privacy, so asking for privacy is an invitation. We just establish who you are without letting the piece define it. Clara looked at him. You're good at this, she said. I've had to be. What would the statement say? He had been thinking about this since the parking garage. It says that we've been getting to know each other, that she's a research coordinator at Clearwater Advocacy doing critical environmental work, and that neither of us will be making further comment. He paused. No personal details. No quotes about feelings. No counter-narrative about money or the lack of it. Just the factual reality of who you are, in your own terms, before someone else gets to assign you terms. She thought about it. Sophie, who had finished eating and was back to her drawing, said without looking up, What's a statement? It's when you say something officially so people know what's true, Ethan said. Like when you told me straight about Mom coming, Sophie said. Ethan looked at her. Yes, he said, exactly like that. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and kept drawing. Clara was watching Sophie. Then she looked at Ethan. Okay, she said, do the statement. The statement went out Saturday morning, drafted by Ethan's publicist with Clara's one revision. She had asked them to add the specific name of the case Clearwater was currently working, the agricultural diversion case, because she said if her name was going to be in public circulation, she would rather have it attached to the work than to a romantic narrative. His publicist had looked at this request with the carefully neutral expression of someone choosing not to editorialize and had made the change. The piece ran Monday, shorter than Caulfield had originally intended, and minus several details, because the statement had taken the oxygen out of the contrast angle. Without the contrast, without the implicit suggestion that this was a man who had inexplicably chosen someone beneath him, the story had less of a story. It ran, but it ran smaller than it would have, and Clara's name was in it as a research coordinator doing critical environmental work, which was what she was, which was all she had agreed to. Her supervisor called her Monday morning. Clara told Ethan about it that evening on the phone, her voice carrying the slight tightness of someone who had gotten through something they'd been braced for. Dr. Osei asked if it was going to be a distraction, Clara said. What did you say? I said no. I said my personal life was mine, and my professional work was separate, and I didn't intend to conflate them. A pause. She said she appreciated the directness, and that was the end of it. That's good. She also said... Clara stopped, started again. She said she'd read the statement and was glad I'd framed it around the work. She said she used the word dignified. Her voice was slightly different on the last word, like it had hit something. Ethan didn't fill the silence. Nobody uses that word for me, Clara said quietly. They usually use words like serious or competent or intense. Dignified is... She stopped. It's accurate, he said. She didn't respond for a moment. Ethan, she said. Yeah. I don't know how to... She stopped, and he heard it, the specific halt of a woman who moved through the world in precise language, running up against the edge of something she didn't have precise language for yet. Thank you for calling me first, before your publicist, before anyone else. Before the machine of your life engaged with this problem, you called me and told me and asked what I wanted. He didn't say, "Of course I did," because he understood what she was saying beneath the surface of it, that she had not, in the past, been the first call, that she had been the person told after decisions were made, managed around, kept clean of complications. He understood that he had done something by calling her first that she was not going to diminish by treating it as obvious. "Always," he said. Another silence. "I have to tell you something," she said. "Okay. I said I was in, last week, on the phone, and I meant it, but I want you to know that saying it was harder than anything else I've done recently. Harder than the deposition, harder than the Caulfield thing, harder than—" She paused. "I've been on my own for a long time, and not accidentally. I chose it, after the last time, because being on your own doesn't cost you anything, and being in something costs you everything you put in." Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. "And I put a lot in, the last time, and I got nothing back. Less than nothing. I got the version of myself I'd given over, handed back to me in pieces." He sat with that. "I'm not him," he said. He said it knowing that it was the thing every person who came after a damage said, and knowing also that it was the only true thing. "I know you're not," she said. "I've known that since the first coffee. That's not what I'm afraid of. What I'm afraid of is me, that I'll hold back so much to protect myself that I give you the careful version instead of the real one." "You've never given me the careful version," he said. "Not once." "I've given you careful delivery," she said. "That's not the same thing. The content has been real. The delivery has been managed." He thought about that. "Show me the unmanaged version when you're ready," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." "What if it's ugly?" "Clara." He said her name with a kind of patience that was not performance. "I have a daughter who put her cold feet on my kidneys at 6 in the morning and then told me the dream she had about a horse that could do algebra. I have a workshop in my basement with 13 years of mistakes cut into the bench. I have a phone full of texts from an ex-wife about logistics and a grandfather's plane hanging on a wall and a list of furniture I've made for people in difficult situations that I keep in my phone so I don't forget them." He paused. "I am not interested in the smooth version of anything." A silence that was different from all the previous ones. Not thoughtful, not careful, something more open. "Okay," she said, and her voice had come down from the managed register to something he could only describe as Clara, the actual one, fully present on the other end of the line. "Okay." They talked for another hour. She told him about the last relationship. Not the full story, not yet, but the shape of it. A man who had loved the version of her he'd built in his head and spent 2 years quietly resentful that the real one kept showing up instead. She told him that at the end she'd looked at herself in the mirror and not recognized the amount of space she'd contracted herself into to make his version fit, and that it had taken her 8 months after it ended to start to take up her actual space again. He told her about the marriage, more than he'd told her at Morrow's. Jennifer, who had been ambitious in a way he'd admired and then found himself quietly competing with, and the way they had become, over 4 years, 2 people running parallel rather than together, and the baby who arrived and exposed everything the parallel running had been papering over, and the morning he'd come downstairs and known, before any conversation, before any confrontation, that it was over. Just known it the way you know a joint has failed before you test the weight on it. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "The marriage ending?" "Not the way I expected it to. Mostly it hurt that Sophie wouldn't have both of us in the same house. That's the part that's still—" He stopped. "That part doesn't go away." "No," Clara said, "it wouldn't. But I'm not damaged by it," he said. "I know I'm supposed to be, in the narrative sense, the billionaire single father carrying wounds. But mostly what it did was clarify what I needed, what I wasn't willing to do without." "What wasn't you willing to do without?" He thought about a walnut offcut held in his hands at midnight, a name written at the top of a blank page, a question asked across a dinner table in a voice that didn't reach for attention. "Someone who wants the real answer," he said. Clara was quiet. "You know what the first thing I thought was," she said, "when you told the story about the desk, the widow's desk." "What?" "I thought, this man is lonely," she said. Not in the simple way, not the obvious way. I thought he has everything, and he's still building furniture for strangers at night because he needs to know he's doing something that matters. And I thought, I understand that. A pause. I'm in a job that pays nothing compared to what I could make with my education, working on cases that take years to resolve, and every single day I do it because I need to know I'm doing something real, something that holds. She paused. We have the same disease. He almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. Is that what it is? He said. I think so, she said. The needing it to be real, the not knowing how to do something that isn't. Is that why you asked the question? He said. The first one, at dinner. She was quiet for a moment. I asked it because I needed to know if you were real, she said, or if you were the version, the profile piece, the billionaire with a hobby and a conscience. A pause. When you hesitated, when you went past the easy answer to the widow and the desk and the 41 years of letters, I knew. Knew what? That you were real, she said simply, and that was going to cost me something. He held the phone and looked at the kitchen window where the November dark was pressed against the glass, and he thought about what it cost to be real for someone, the specific price of being seen clearly and choosing to stay where the scene was happening. I know what it costs, he said. It's worth it. She didn't answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice was the quietest it had ever been with him. Not small, not reduced, just very close, the way something sounds when all the space has been taken out of it. Yeah, she said, it is. December came in cold and practical, the way December does in a city that doesn't have the luxury of pretending the year isn't ending. The water rights case broke open on the 9th of the month. Clara called Ethan at 4:30 in the afternoon, and he picked up on the first ring because he had learned by then the specific frequency of her calls, the ones that were logistical, the ones that were conversational, and the ones where something had happened. This was the last kind. We got the hearing date, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who has just received news large enough that they're still locating themselves relative to it. March. The full evidentiary hearing, the documentation held. He was in the workshop. He set down the plane he'd been holding. Clara, 11 years, she said. That farmer has been diverting that water for 11 years, and we finally have a hearing with actual authority behind it. A pause, and he heard her exhale. Not a dramatic exhale, just a real one, the kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for longer than you knew. Dr. Osei cried. I didn't know she could do that. What did you do? A short silence. I went into the bathroom for about 4 minutes, she said, and then I came back out and started preparing for what comes next. He almost laughed. Of course you did. There's a lot that comes next, she said, and he could hear the shift already. The grief of the release replaced by the machine of her engagement. The hearing itself, the expert witnesses, the opposing legal team is going to come in with everything they have. We have probably 12 weeks of intensive preparation. You've been preparing for 2 years, he said. Preparing for a hearing is different from preparing the case, she said. The case is the building. The hearing is whether the building holds. He thought about joints, about weight testing, about the specific moment you put a finished piece of furniture on the floor and let it bear what it was made to bear. It'll hold, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I hope so, she said, and the 2 words contained everything she wasn't saying. The years of slow documentation, the procedural setbacks, the filing error that had cost 3 weeks, the Tuesday nights on the phone talking through depositions, the 40 pages of waterboard testimony condensed into something a judge could use. 11 years of a farmer diverting water from people who needed it, and the long, painstaking, unglamorous work of building a paper trail that finally, in March, someone with authority would have to look at and decide about. Come over tonight, he said. Both of us can make dinner. Sophie's been asking to teach someone how to make the eggs she likes. Sophie's been asking to teach me how to make eggs. She's been asking to teach someone, he said. You're the most likely candidate. That's very specific flattery, she said. Take it or leave it. Another pause, and then the almost laugh that had become, over these months, one of his most reliable anchors. I'll be there at 6:30, she said. Gerald needs air in his tires, so I'll be on the bus. I can pick you up? I like the bus, she said. I think on the bus. He had stopped trying to solve things she didn't need solved. 6:30, he said. She came at 6:32, slightly wind-chilled from the walk from the stop, and Sophie greeted her at the door with an explanation of the egg method that began before Clara had fully entered the house. Clara listened through taking off her jacket and setting down her bag and finding a seat at the kitchen counter. And then she and Sophie made eggs while Ethan handled the rest of dinner. And Sophie explained each step with the serious authority of someone passing on knowledge they consider important. And Clara followed instructions exactly, which Sophie noticed and approved of. She did it right, Sophie told Ethan with the tone of someone issuing a professional assessment. I know, he said. Most people do it wrong. I know that too, he said. Clara from the stove said without turning around, I had good instruction. Sophie received this with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose standards have been met and went to set the table. Later, after dinner, after Sophie had gone to bed, she had said goodnight to Clara with the same matter-of-fact ease she said it to Ethan, the good night of someone for whom this person was already woven into the ordinary fabric of the evening. Ethan and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the leftover warmth of a cooked meal still in the room and the specific quiet of a house after a child is asleep. She's going to be okay, Clara said, not in the abstract, with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention for weeks. Sophie, whatever comes with Jennifer visiting in March, whatever changes, she's going to be okay. She has a center. She's always had one, Ethan said. I take exactly 0 credit for it. You take too little credit for too many things, Clara said. He looked at her. You do, she said, meeting his look without backing off it. You do it as a kind of deflection. Modesty as a way to avoid being seen claiming something. But Sophie's center exists partly because you paid attention, because you told her things straight, because you sat on the kitchen floor and let her explain octopuses to you, even when she'd already told you and you already knew. She paused. That's not nothing. That's not luck. That's years of work. He looked at the table. The same is true, she said, quieter, of the furniture, of the work. You do that thing where you say, it's just something to do, it's nothing, it's just wood. But it's not. And I think you know it's not. I think you've known it for a long time, and you're afraid that if you say it plainly, that this work matters, that it fills something real in you, that you need it the way some people need other things. You're afraid that sounds arrogant or self-congratulatory, or like you want credit for helping people. He was quiet. It's not arrogant, she said. It's just true, and you're allowed to let it be true. The kitchen held that for a moment. You do that, he said. Do what? Give me the thing I needed to hear instead of the thing I was expecting. I've been told it's a personality flaw, she said. Who told you that? The last relationship, she said. The simple shorthand they'd arrived at for that period of her life. She said it without the weight she'd said it with in November. Not healed, not resolved, but located correctly. Something from the past that she knew the dimensions of and had stopped letting define the present. He said I was too direct, that I made people feel analyzed. I don't feel analyzed, Ethan said. I know, she said. That was one of the first things I noticed. What was? That you didn't flinch. She picked up her water glass, held it without drinking. Most people flinch when I say the accurate thing, even when they ask for it. There's always this moment where they want honesty in theory, and then the honesty arrives and they... She made a small gesture that encompassed the general retreat of people who couldn't handle what they'd asked for. You didn't, not once. He thought about the dinner table, the question, the 30 seconds of internal rearrangement before he'd given the true answer. The coffee shop, her observation about the widow's desk and the false modesty, the shock of being read correctly by someone who had known him for 3 hours. The workshop, her saying, I don't want to be careful anymore. I've been waiting for the accurate thing for a long time, he said. She looked at him, set down the glass. Me too, she said. Christmas happened the way Christmas happens when you have a 6-year-old, with complete and unironic commitment. Sophie had opinions about every element. The tree had to be the specific kind with the soft needles, not the stiff kind. The ornaments had to be hung in a sequence that made internal sense to Sophie, even if it wasn't visible to anyone else. The Christmas Eve dinner had to include the potato dish that Mrs. Garfield had made the previous year and the year before that, which meant negotiating with Mrs. Garfield about the recipe, which she surrendered with the reluctance of someone who wasn't sure she was handing over something that would be done correctly. Clara spent Christmas Eve with them. This had not been formally decided. It had accumulated, the way most things between them accumulated, through a series of small practical decisions that added up to something larger than any individual choice. Vanessa was spending the holiday with their mother in Sacramento. Clara had been invited and had made the specific decision, fully informed, to stay. She had called her mother on Christmas Eve morning, and Ethan had not asked about the call, and she had not offered details. But she had arrived at the house at 4 in the afternoon with a bag that indicated she was staying and a small wrapped package for Sophie that she placed under the tree with the casual precision of someone who had thought about it without making it a production. Sophie opened it the next morning, a small field guide to North American rocks and minerals, with a handwritten note tucked inside the front cover that said, in Clara's small, careful handwriting, for the collection. The best specimens are in the places nobody else is looking. Sophie read the note twice. Then she looked at Clara across the living room in the specific way she'd looked at her at that first kitchen table meeting. The full inventory look, everything being filed. This is the right book, Sophie said. I thought it might be, Clara said. How did you know which one? I looked at what you had, Clara said. You didn't have this one. Sophie held the book for a moment longer. Then she set it carefully on the coffee table, not with the ordinary carelessness of a child moving on to the next thing, but with the deliberateness of someone placing something in the category of things that matter. Ethan watched this from across the room. He watched his daughter assign Clara to the category of people who looked at what was actually there and responded to it. And the emotion that moved through him was not simple enough to name. It was the compound thing, the multiple thing, the kind that only arrives when something you needed and something you feared and something you didn't know you were still hoping for all arrive at the same moment, and you have to hold all of them at once. He went to the kitchen to make coffee. Clara followed him in a few minutes later, and he didn't hear her until she was beside him at the counter. She leaned against the edge and looked at him. You're doing the thing, she said. What thing? The thing where something good happens and you go somewhere else in your head. He set down the coffee container, turned to look at her. I'm trying to figure out how to say something, he said. Say it the real way, she said, not the managed way. He looked at her in the kitchen on Christmas morning, the tree lit in the next room, his daughter putting batteries in something with the focused effort of a 6-year-old who trusts that the instructions will yield to sufficient application of force. The house around them, with its middle phase restoration and its permanent smell of wood and coffee and all the ordinary evidence of a life actually being lived in a space. I love you, he said. He said it the real way, not built up to, not preceded by a speech, not ornamented. Just the sentence that was true, said in the kitchen over the coffee maker on Christmas morning. I've known it for a while, and I've been taking my time with it because I didn't want to say it until I was sure it was the right thing and not just the thing I wanted to say. She looked at him. The silence lasted long enough to breathe. I know you love me, she said. I know you know, he said. I wanted to say it. She looked at him for another moment. Her eyes were clear and direct. The same eyes that had looked up from a dinner table and asked one question in a voice that didn't reach for attention, that had looked at his grandfather's plane correctly, that had looked at his daughter's rock collection and understood what it was for. I love you, she said. I've been not saying it because I was... She stopped, started again. Because saying it out loud makes it real in a way that it can be lost. And I've been learning, slowly, that keeping something safe by not naming it is not actually keeping it safe. It's just keeping it small. Don't keep it small, he said. I won't, she said. From the living room, Sophie said with enormous satisfaction, It works. They both looked toward the door. Batteries, Ethan said. Batteries, Clara agreed. They stood in the kitchen for another moment, and it was ordinary and it was not ordinary, and both of those things were true at the same time, which was, Ethan had come to understand, what the real version of things felt like. Not the smooth arc, not the resolved story, just the compound truth of a morning in December with coffee and a child in the next room and a woman beside him who had told him who he was before he'd entirely known it himself. The new year arrived without ceremony. Clara's hearing preparation consumed most of January and February, and the shape of their life during those months was structured around it. The evenings when she came to the house after late nights at Clearwater, Still going through testimony notes at the kitchen table while Sophie did homework, the two of them occasionally parallel working in the kitchen with the easy silence of people who had stopped needing to fill space. The Sundays when Ethan brought her food and stayed out of the way and let her work, and she surfaced periodically to say something to him that had nothing to do with the case and then went back under. He learned things about her during those months that the more spacious early weeks hadn't shown him. He learned that she became irritable, specifically when she had been sitting still for too long and needed to move. She would start to give monosyllabic answers and then catch herself and say, "I need to walk. Can we walk?" And they would go outside and walk the neighborhood blocks until she'd processed whatever was stuck. He learned that she cried exactly once during the whole preparation period, quietly, at the kitchen table on a Thursday night in February, when a key expert witness backed out for reasons that were bureaucratic and infuriating, and she cried for about 6 minutes and then stopped and said, "Okay, who else do we have?" and got back on the laptop. He learned that she ate badly when she was deep in work, not dramatically badly, just the forgetful badly of someone who didn't notice hunger until it became a problem, and that the best intervention was putting food within her physical reach without making an announcement about it, because an announcement made her feel managed, and feeling managed made her worse. He learned that she talked in her sleep occasionally, not words, just sounds, and that she slept on the left side, and that she woke at 5:15 most mornings whether she needed to or not, and that she almost always made the coffee before he was fully conscious, and that the sound of the coffee maker had become, over the months, the sound of her being there. He learned that she was funnier than she let most people see. There was a dry, specific humor that appeared in private that was completely absent in public, and he thought about what it meant that he was on the inside of that particular door, that she had decided at some point, without announcing it, that he was the kind of person you showed the funny to. He took that seriously without making too much of it. He learned that she was afraid of being a burden, not in the way people say it as a disclaimer, genuinely afraid of it, with the specific history of a person who had spent a long time being self-sufficient as a survival strategy and had not yet fully separated self-sufficiency from self-worth. When something was hard, she went quiet first and worked through it alone first, and only offered it after she'd managed the worst of it. And he knew this and tried not to push, and also tried to make clear, in the specific language of action rather than statement, that she was not a burden when she brought him the hard thing, that having it was better than not having it. She was getting better at offering it earlier. He noticed this and didn't comment on it because commenting would have made it a thing she was performing rather than a thing she was doing. He was not, in any of this, perfect. He missed things. He got absorbed in the workshop for too long on evenings when she needed him present. There was a Tuesday in February when she said something about a problem at work, and he responded with a solution before she'd finished saying the thing. And she went quiet in the specific way that meant he'd done the thing she'd told him she didn't want. And he caught it and apologized, and she said, "I know you're trying to help." And he said, "I know that's not the point." And they sat with it for a few minutes, and then she continued, and he listened, and that was what getting it wrong and then getting it right looked like when you were actually doing it. He remembered saying that to her in November. He was still learning what he'd meant. Jennifer arrived the second Saturday of March, 3 days before the hearing. Ethan had told Clara about the timing, and Clara had looked at the calendar without comment and then said, "That's a hard week for you." Not accusatory, not concerned in the loaded way, just accurate. He appreciated that she named the complexity without trying to resolve it for him. Jennifer was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he'd expected. She was thinner than he remembered. She arrived at the house on Saturday morning with a rental car and a nervousness she was managing well but not completely hiding, and Sophie came to the door and looked at her mother with the serious inventory look, and then let her in, and Ethan made coffee and stepped back. He watched Jennifer with Sophie for an hour. He watched his ex-wife with their daughter, and it was difficult in the specific way it was always going to be difficult. Not because of lingering feeling, not because of what had been, but because Sophie deserved everything from both of them and could not have the configuration that would have delivered everything. And that was a loss that didn't resolve, only became something you carried correctly. Jennifer was good with her, he noted. Clumsy in the way of someone who didn't have daily practice. Uncertain about the rhythms of a 6-year-old who had grown and changed in ways she'd missed, but good. She brought Sophie a small present, a geology book, which Ethan noted with a specific quiet irony, a different one from Clara's, and Sophie added it to the shelf with the deliberate placement she used for things that mattered. Ethan gave them most of the day. He went to the workshop and worked and came up for lunch and then went back. And at 4 in the afternoon, Jennifer knocked on the workshop door and came down the stairs. He set down the plane. She looked around the workshop the way people looked when they encountered it for the first time, not with the specific attention Clara had brought, but with a general recognition of what the space was. "She's wonderful," Jennifer said, meaning Sophie. "I know," he said. "I've missed—" She stopped. He watched her find the words that were honest rather than the ones that were self-protecting. "I've missed things I can't get back, I know that." "Yes," he said. "I'm not asking you to say it's okay," she said. "Good," he said, not unkindly, "because it's not entirely okay. But we can keep working on what it is." She looked at the tools on the wall, at the half-finished piece on the bench, a small writing desk, maple, for a family Ethan was making it for, a father and daughter who had come through a rough 2 years and needed something that belonged to them in their new place. "You're happy," Jennifer said. Not a question. He looked at her. "I saw it when I came in," she said. "The house has it's different from before." She paused. "Is it serious?" "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Good," she said, and he believed she meant it. The hearing began on a Tuesday. Clara had been at this courthouse since 7:30, which Ethan knew because she'd texted him from outside the building. A rare morning text, just, "Building looks the same as it always does. I keep expecting something to look different when things matter." He had written back, "You look different when things matter. The building doesn't have to." A pause, and then, "Go in. You've built the whole thing. Now let it hold." She had gone in. He had spent the day with Sophie at school, drop-off, and then in the office, and then in the workshop, and then back in the office. And he checked his phone more than he ordinarily did and caught himself doing it and kept doing it anyway. She texted at 12:40. First session done. It held. Then at 4:15, opposing counsel tried 3 things. 2 of them failed entirely. 1 landed, but we have the counter documentation. Then at 6:05, day 1, 12 more to go, going home to sleep. He called her. "Eat first," he said when she answered. "I ate," she said. "What did you eat?" A pause that confirmed what he suspected. "I'll eat when I get home. There's food at the house," he said. "If you want to not be alone tonight." A longer pause. "I don't want to come and fall asleep on your couch," she said. "Clara," he said. "Yeah." "Come fall asleep on my couch." She came. She ate the food he put in front of her without him making it an announcement about her eating habits, which had taken practice and which he had mostly gotten right. Sophie, who had a school night bedtime she was not flexible about, said goodnight to Clara at 7:55 with a hug that was brief and matter-of-fact, the hug of someone for whom physical affection had become a natural and unloaded part of the relationship. Not performed, not significant, just there. Clara sat on the couch after Sophie went up. Ethan sat beside her and she leaned into him with the particular lean of someone who has been holding themselves upright for a very long time and has, for this moment, decided they don't have to. 12 more days, she said. 12 more days, he said. Then we find out if 11 years of someone taking what didn't belong to them is going to be corrected. The documentation holds, he said. I know, she said. She was quiet for a moment. I know it holds. I built it to hold, but knowing you built something right and then having to wait to find out if it actually holds when it matters. She stopped. That's its own thing? Yes, he said. He thought about finished furniture, about weight testing, about the joint you'd cut correctly, and the moment you found out whether correctly was enough. How do you do that? She said. The waiting. You don't do it gracefully, he said. You just keep moving until there's something to know. She was quiet against him. Ethan, she said. Yeah. Thank you for not trying to make this easier than it is. He thought about that, about the specific work of not making things easier than they were, of not offering comfort that costs the truth, not smoothing over the difficulty to protect someone from the accurate shape of it. He had been trying to do that since Morrow's, since the first conversation where she'd told him precisely what she didn't need and he had tried, with imperfect consistency, to provide what she did. "You told me who you were," he said. "A long time ago. I've just been trying to keep up." She made the almost laugh sound. "You've kept up fine," she said. The hearing ran 13 days. Ethan was not in the courtroom for most of them. It was her work, her case, and she had not asked him to be there. He was present in the ways she'd allowed and requested: the food within reach, the evenings at the house when she needed to not be alone with her own head, the calls on the late nights when something had gone well or gone wrong and needed to be said out loud to someone who would receive it without editing it. She called him on the 7th day, which had been hard. The opposing legal team had put forward a hydrological expert whose testimony had been technically formidable, and Clara's expert had responded well but not perfectly, and the day had ended with the feeling of a thing that was still uncertain. He listened for 20 minutes, asked 2 questions, did not offer the verdict on how it was going to go. "I don't know if we have it," she said, the rare admission, the one she'd have kept inside herself 6 months ago. "I know," he said. "I did everything right," she said, and her voice had an edge in it that was not complaint. It was the specific edge of a person who has worked as hard and as correctly as they knew how to, and is confronting the fact that effort and outcome are not always the same. "You did," he said. "That should be enough." "It should," he said. "It doesn't always work that way." She was quiet. "What do you do?" she said. "When you build something as right as you know how and it still isn't enough?" He thought about it honestly. "You figure out what you missed," he said, "and you build it into the next thing, and you don't stop building." A long silence. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Clara texted him at 3:47. "We won." 2 words. After 11 years of illegal diversion, 2 years of her work, 13 days of hearing, 40 pages of testimony condensed into something a judge could use, a filing error that had cost 3 weeks, an expert witness who had backed out in February, all the downstream landowners who had been losing water access for over a decade. After all of it, we won. He was in the workshop. He stood at the bench with his phone in his hands and looked at those 2 words for a long moment. He texted back, "I know." 3 dots appeared. Then, "You don't know. You hoped." "Same thing when you build correctly," he wrote. A pause. Then, "I'm crying in the courthouse bathroom. Take your time," he wrote. "Dr. Osei is outside the door asking if I'm okay. What are you going to tell her? That I'm fine, that I'm better than fine." He set the phone down on the bench. He put his hand flat on the workbench surface, the years of grain and mark and history under his palm. And he stood in the basement workshop in the afternoon and felt the particular kind of fullness that arrives when something you built turns out to be exactly what it was supposed to be. He did not cry. He did something adjacent to it that did not have a name. Clara came that evening. She arrived at the door and her eyes were still slightly swollen from the courthouse bathroom. And she was wearing the dark green jacket she'd worn the first time she came to the workshop. And her hair was down and unstyled, and she looked like what she was. A woman who had just finished the hardest thing she'd done in years and was standing on the other side of it. Sophie was at the kitchen counter doing homework when Clara came in. She looked up. "Clara wins?" she said. She had known, in the general understanding of a 6-year-old who tracks the important things, that something big was happening this week. "Clara wins," Clara said. Sophie processed this. Then she said with complete seriousness, "Good. The farmer was wrong." "He was," Clara said. "Does he have to stop now?" "He has to stop," Clara said, "and he has to fix what he broke." Sophie nodded once, the conclusive nod, case closed, and went back to her homework. Ethan looked at Clara across the kitchen. She looked back at him. The particular look, not the recalibration look, not the careful thought look, not the almost smile. The look she had underneath all those. The one that didn't have management in it. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held, fully, without the half-second tension of someone deciding whether to accept it. She put her head against his shoulder, and she was just there, just weight and presence, the physical reality of her in the kitchen on the evening she won the thing she'd been building toward for 2 years. "You built it to hold," he said quietly. "We built ours to hold," she said. Her voice was slightly muffled against his shoulder. He thought about that for a moment. Yeah, he said. We did. Months later, in the early warmth of a May that was not yet humid, when the Craftsman house's front yard was starting to look like someone cared about it, which they did, a couple from Priya and James's neighborhood saw them at the farmer's market. The same farmer's market where Ethan and Clara had run into each other the first time, across a row of tomatoes. Clara was looking at something. Squash, probably. She had a specific interest in squash that she maintained without apology. And Sophie was 2 stalls down examining what appeared to be a collection of unusual dried beans, with the focused attention she brought to things that had structure worth understanding. Ethan was standing between them in the way he stood between them in most places now, present to both, not pulled between. The couple from the neighborhood, friendly people, the kind of people who attended community meetings and remembered names, stopped to say hello. The woman said something pleasant about the weather, and the man mentioned that he'd read about Clara's case in the local paper, the hearing, the verdict. Clara said thank you without the deflection she would have used 6 months ago. She said it and meant it and moved on. On the walk back to the car, Sophie between them, the bag of vegetables over Ethan's shoulder, the woman from the neighborhood said something to her companion, just loud enough to be heard. Wasn't that Ethan Vale? With some woman? Sophie, who had the hearing of a person who paid attention, looked up at Clara. You're not some woman, Sophie said with the particular authority of a 6-year-old who considers mislabeling a serious offense. Clara looked down at her. No, she said, I'm not. You're Clara, Sophie said, as if this were obvious and sufficient, and also the most important fact about the situation. I am, she said. Ethan said nothing. He had learned, over the months, that some moments were better received than claimed. Later that evening, after dinner, after Sophie was in bed, after the kitchen was quiet with the specific quiet of a house settling into the end of a day, Clara said, She called me some woman. She did, Ethan said. Sophie corrected her. Sophie corrects everyone, he said. She considers it a public service. Clara looked at her coffee cup, then quietly, at him. People are going to do that, she said, for a while, maybe longer. The contrast is going to be a thing that people land on because it's easy, and the real story requires more work. The contrast isn't the story, he said. I know, she said, but I want to say something about it directly while we're both here, before it becomes something we just absorb. Say it, he said. She held her coffee cup. She looked at him with the eyes that had looked up from a dinner table a year ago and asked a question that still lived in him, that had changed something he'd needed changed. I'm not a story about what you chose despite, she said. I'm not the quiet poor girl who turned out to matter. I'm Clara Reed, and I built a case that gave 11 years of stolen water back to the people who needed it, and I have a bike named Gerald and a grandfather's scar on my left hand, and I know which way to hold a plane, and I was at a dinner table on a Saturday night, and I asked you a question because I needed to know if you were real, and you were, and that's the story. She paused. That's all of it. There's no contrast in that. There's just 2 people who were both looking for the real thing and found it. The kitchen was quiet around her words. He looked at her. The dark green jacket over the chair behind her. The small, careful woman who had walked into a room where nobody saw her and changed the entire direction of his life with 4 words in a quiet voice. That's the story, he said. That's all of it, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. She looked down at his hand around hers for a moment. Then she turned her palm up and held on. They sat in the kitchen in the May evening, in the Craftsman house that was almost done with its middle phase, above the workshop where the tools were oiled and the bench held its years, and a maple writing desk was nearly finished for a father and daughter who needed something of their own. Sophie was asleep upstairs with her rocks on the windowsill and her field guide on the nightstand and her organized collection of evidence about the world. Gerald was locked to the fence outside. The night was quiet. The city moved beyond the windows with its usual indifference to the specific human arrangements occurring within it. Somewhere downstream, water was moving through channels it was supposed to move through, freed by 13 days in a courtroom and 2 years of careful, unglamorous documentation, now going where it had always been going before someone decided they could take it. Things returned to where they should be sometimes. Not always, and not without work, and not without the specific people who are willing to build the paper trail and sit in the courtroom and put their hands flat on a new surface and say, "He would have loved this." Not without the people who ask the right question and then wait fully for the real answer. Not without the ones who look at what's actually there. There is no lesson in this that can be separated from its parts and held up as clean and universal. People who look for the clean lesson will not find it here. What happened between Ethan Vale and Clara Reed happened because of specific, irreducible things. A question asked in a specific voice in a specific room, a man who told the true story instead of the polished one, a woman who said okay when she meant it and not before, a 6-year-old who audited people against a bear book and found one person acceptable. The slow accumulation of evenings and phone calls and walnut chairs and water rights and cold feet on a back at 5 in the morning. The particular trust that is built the way good furniture is built. Not quickly, not for show, but joint by joint, checking the fit at every stage, built to bear weight because it was made to. There is no shortcut to that. There is no substitute for the question honestly asked, and the answer honestly given, and the willingness to sit still while both of those things do what they need to do. On the kitchen table between them, his hand around hers turned up and holding on, was the ordinary evidence of a year's worth of real. It was enough. It was in every way that mattered more than enough. She had asked the question. He had answered it. And everything that followed was the consequence of two people deciding, slowly, imperfectly, at cost, to keep telling each other the truth. That was all. That was everything.